The flames had barely died when they dragged her from the ashes of her family's homestead. Ella Whitmore, once a free woman with dreams of frontier life, now stumbled through the wilderness in chains, her captors' laughter echoing through the canyon walls. But somewhere in the vast Dakota territory, a Lakota warrior named Cheyenne Blackhawk heard whispers of her suffering. What he would do next would ignite a clash between two worlds, challenge ancient laws, and prove that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Welcome to a story of survival, courage, and redemption that will take you deep into the untamed American frontier. Stay with me until the very end to discover how love conquered hate, and please comment below with your city so I can see how far this incredible tale has traveled across the world. The morning sun had painted the Montana sky in shades of amber and rose when the Apache war party crested the ridge overlooking the Whitmore homestead. 12 warriors, their faces streaked with war paint, sat motionless on their horses as they surveyed the valley below. Smoke curled lazily from the cabin's chimney, and somewhere in the distance a woman's voice drifted on the morning breeze, singing a hymn as she hung laundry on the line. Tahuros, the scarred leader whose face bore the permanent mark of a cavalry saber, raised his hand. His warriors knew that gesture well. It meant death was coming to the valley. "The white eyes have taken too much," he whispered, his voice like gravel grinding against stone. "Today, we take back." Below in the valley, Ella Whitmore had no idea that her world was about to end. At 23, she possessed the kind of beauty that made frontier men stammer and stumble over their words. Auburn hair that caught sunlight like spun copper eyes, the color of spring grass, and a spirit that had carried her family through 3 harsh winters on the Dakota frontier. She hummed as she worked, hanging her husband's shirts and her daughter's tiny dresses, completely unaware of the death watching from the hills. "Mama, when's Papa coming home?" 7-year-old Sarah skipped across the yard, her blonde braids bouncing with each step. The child's question sent a familiar pang through Ella's chest. Thomas had been gone for 2 weeks now, riding to Fort Collins for supplies that their isolated homestead desperately needed. He should have been back days ago. "Soon, sweetheart," Ella replied, forcing brightness into her voice. "You know how your father gets distracted by all those interesting people in town." Sarah giggled and ran toward the chicken coop, her laughter carrying across the valley like wind chimes. It was the last sound of innocence that place would ever hear. The attack came without warning, as they always did. One moment Ella was reaching for another wet shirt, and the next the thunder of hoofbeats filled the air like an approaching storm. She spun around, her heart already racing with primal fear, and saw them pouring down the hillside like a dark tide, painted warriors with weapons gleaming in the morning sun. "Sarah!" Ella screamed, dropping the laundry basket and sprinting toward her daughter. "Sarah, run to the root cellar." The little girl froze by the chicken coop, her blue eyes wide with terror, as the warriors surrounded the homestead. Chickens scattered in explosive bursts of feathers and panicked squawking. One of the Apache warriors, barely more than a boy himself, let out a war cry that seemed to split the very air. Ella reached Sarah just as the first arrow whistled past her ear, embedding itself in the cabin wall with a solid thunk. She scooped up her daughter and ran, her skirts tangling around her legs as she struggled across the uneven ground toward the small storm cellar they dug behind the house. "Mama, I'm scared," Sarah sobbed against her shoulder. "I know, baby, I know. Just hold on to me." But they never made it to the cellar. A rope settled around Ella's shoulders like a striking snake, jerking her backward with such force that she lost her grip on Sarah. The little girl tumbled to the ground, crying out as her knee scraped against a sharp rock. Tahuros rode up slowly, his scarred face impassive, as he looked down at the woman and child. His horse, a massive black stallion with eyes like polished obsidian, snorted and pawed the ground impatiently. "Burn it," he commanded in Apache, never taking his eyes off Ella. Within minutes, flames were licking at the cabin's walls. The home that Thomas had built with his own hands, board by careful board, began to collapse in on itself with sounds like breaking bones. Ella watched in horror as 3 years of their life together turned to ash and smoke. "Please," she whispered, pulling Sarah closer. "Please, she's just a child." Tahuro studied them both for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he spoke a single word in Apache that Ella didn't understand, but his warriors did. 2 of them dismounted and approached the terrified woman and child. "No!" Ella screamed, fighting against the rope as strong hands seized Sarah. "No, don't take her, take me, but leave her alone." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The warriors were already lifting Sarah onto one of their horses, the little girl's screams piercing the air like a physical wound. Ella lunged forward, desperate to reach her daughter, but the rope around her shoulders held firm. "Sarah, Sarah, I'll find you. I promise I'll find you." The last thing Ella saw before a heavy blow to her head sent her into darkness was her daughter's tear-streaked face disappearing into the distance, carried away by warriors who showed no more emotion than if they were herding cattle. When consciousness returned, the world had become a nightmare of pain and smoke. Ella's head throbbed with each heartbeat, and her wrists burned where rawhide bonds cut into her skin. She was draped over the back of a horse like a sack of grain, her long hair hanging down to brush against the animal's legs with each jarring step. The acrid smell of her burning home still hung in the air, a constant reminder of everything she'd lost. Through the haze of pain and disorientation, one thought burned brighter than all the rest: Sarah. Where was Sarah? "She lives," came a voice from nearby, speaking English with a heavy accent. Ella managed to lift her head slightly and saw one of the younger warriors riding beside her. Unlike the others, this one's face held something that might have been sympathy. "My daughter," Ella croaked, her throat raw from smoke and screaming. "Where is she?" The warrior glanced toward the front of the column, where Tahuros rode like a dark prophet of the apocalypse. "Separated," he said simply. "Safer that way." "Safer for who?" Ella's voice broke on the words. The warrior didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. They planned to sell them, mother and daughter, separated, broken apart like pieces of a shattered mirror that could never be made whole again. For 3 days they rode deeper into the wilderness, following game trails and creek beds that seemed to lead to the very edge of the world. Ella's captors barely acknowledged her existence except to give her water and strips of dried meat that tasted like leather and salt. At night, they bound her to a tree and posted guards, though where she could run to. In this vast emptiness, she had no idea. On the 4th morning, they reached the Apache camp. It was larger than Ella had imagined. Maybe 50 lodges scattered across a hidden valley, with cook fires sending thin columns of smoke into the dawn sky. Children played between the teepees, while women worked over hides and gathered plants. It looked almost peaceful if you could ignore the weapons everywhere and the scalps hanging from some of the lodge poles like grisly trophies. Tahuros called out something in Apache, and people began to emerge from their homes to see what their war party had brought back. Ella found herself the center of attention as curious eyes examined her like she was some strange animal they'd never seen before. An older woman with silver streaking her black hair approached and spoke rapidly to Tahuros, gesturing toward Ella with obvious disapproval. Whatever she was saying, Tahuros didn't like it. His scarred face darkened, and he barked something back that made the woman step away with lowered eyes. "You belong to me now," he said to Ella in broken English. "You work. You obey. You try to run." He drew his knife and tested its edge against his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood. "You die slow." They untied her from the horse, but left her hands bound as they led her through the camp. Ella stumbled over the uneven ground, her legs weak from days of riding, while Apache children followed at a safe distance, chattering excitedly about the white woman. Her new home, if it could be called that, was a small, windowless lodge on the edge of the camp. Inside it was dark and cramped with barely enough room to lie down. The floor was hard-packed earth, and the air smelled of old smoke and unwashed bodies. "This is where you sleep," Taharos explained, shoving her inside. "Sun comes up, you work. Sun goes down, you come back here." "Simple, yes." Ella said nothing, but her silence seemed to amuse him. "You think your man will come for you?" He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Many suns have passed. If he was coming, he would be here. You are forgotten white woman. The sooner you accept this, the easier your life becomes." He left her alone in the darkness, and for the first time since the attack, Ella allowed herself to truly break down. She wept for her destroyed home, for her missing husband, and most of all for Sarah, sweet, innocent Sarah, who was somewhere in this vast wilderness, probably just as terrified and alone as she was. But tears, she discovered, were a luxury she couldn't afford for long. Before dawn the next morning, the old woman with silver hair came to fetch her. Without speaking, she led Ella to the creek that ran along one side of the camp and handed her a bundle of dirty clothes. The message was clear: wash these or face the consequences. The water was shockingly cold, even in the summer heat, and Ella's hands were soon raw from scrubbing rough fabric against the creek stones. The old woman, whose name she eventually learned was Ayana, watched her work with critical eyes, occasionally barking orders in Apache that Ella couldn't understand, but somehow managed to interpret through context and gesture. When the clothes were clean, there were hides to scrape, corn to grind, and a dozen other tasks that kept her busy from sunrise to sunset. Her back ached constantly from bending over her work, and her hands became a map of cuts and calluses. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the constant worry about Sarah and the gnawing hope that Thomas was still alive somewhere looking for them both. Days blended into weeks and weeks into months. Ella learned to understand basic Apache words out of necessity, and she began to recognize the rhythms of camp life. She learned which warriors to avoid and which women might offer a grudging kindness if she worked hard enough. She learned that Taharos had 3 wives, all of whom despised her presence, and that the scarred leader took particular pleasure in finding new ways to humiliate her. "You smell like white people," he would say when he passed her, wrinkling his nose in mock disgust. "Even after all this time, the stink won't wash off." His favorite torment was to speak of Sarah in front of her, describing in broken English how the little girl was probably dead by now, or worse, sold to traders who would take her far away where no one would ever find her. Ella learned to keep her face blank during these sessions, to show no reaction that might encourage him to continue. But inside each word was like a knife twisting in her chest. She had yellow hair, yes, Taharos said one evening as Ella scraped fat from a deer hide. "Very pretty. The traders, they pay good money for pretty white children, especially the ones who cry a lot." Ella's hands stilled on the hide, but she forced herself to continue working. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Maybe she remembers you," he continued, settling down beside her fire, uninvited. "Maybe she cries for her mama every night. Maybe she wonders why you didn't save her." That was too much. Ella's carefully constructed composure cracked, and she looked up at him with eyes blazing with fury and pain. "She's alive," Ella said quietly, "and someday I'm going to find her and take her home." Taharos laughed and reached out to touch her face, his fingers rough against her skin. "You have spirit, white woman. Good. Breaking you will be more fun than I thought." But breaking Ella Whitmore proved to be more difficult than Taharos had anticipated. Despite the endless work, the poor food, and the constant threat of violence, something inside her refused to surrender. She thought of Sarah every morning when she woke and every night before she fell into exhausted sleep. She thought of Thomas and prayed that he was still looking for them both. And sometimes in her darkest moments she thought of the life they'd been building together, the dreams they'd shared, of expanding their homestead, maybe having more children, growing old together on the frontier they'd chosen to call home. Those dreams kept her alive when nothing else would. 6 months into her captivity, everything changed. It was late afternoon, and Ella was gathering firewood near the edge of camp when she heard the whispers. 2 young warriors were talking in low voices, not realizing she was close enough to hear. Her Apache was still limited, but she caught enough words to understand what they were discussing: another raid planned for the next new moon. And the target was a Lakota settlement 3 days' ride to the north. But it was the next part of their conversation that made her blood turn to ice. They were talking about prisoners, specifically about a white child being held in that Lakota camp. A little girl with yellow hair who cried all the time. Sarah. Ella dropped her bundle of sticks, her hands shaking as the implications hit her. Her daughter was alive. Sarah was alive, and she was only 3 days away. But she was being held by a tribe that Tahuros apparently considered an enemy, which meant that in a few weeks, when the new moon rose, this camp would be planning to attack the very place where her daughter was being held. And in the chaos of a raid, anything could happen to a small white girl caught in the crossfire. That night, Ella lay awake in her cramped lodge, staring up at the hide ceiling and trying to form a plan. She had to warn someone about the coming attack, had to find a way to protect Sarah. But how? She was one woman alone and friendless among enemies, with no weapons and no way to travel the vast distances of the frontier, unless... The idea that formed in her mind was so dangerous, so impossible, that she almost dismissed it immediately. But as she lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the sleeping camp around her, it began to seem like her only chance. She had to escape, not just flee blindly into the wilderness that would only get her killed by wild animals or hostile weather. No, she had to escape with purpose, with a destination in mind. She had to get to that Lakota camp before Tahuros's war party arrived, had to somehow warn them about the coming attack, and find her daughter in the process. It was suicide, of course. Even if she managed to slip away from the Apache camp undetected, she'd be traveling alone through country where 1,000 different deaths waited around every bend. And even if she somehow reached the Lakota settlement alive, they'd probably kill her on sight as an enemy spy. But what choice did she have? Stay here and watch from a distance as her captors destroyed the only chance she had of reuniting with Sarah. Accept Tahuros's endless torments and hope that someday somehow rescue would come from somewhere else. No, she'd rather die trying to save her daughter than live, knowing she'd done nothing. The next few days passed in a haze of preparation and terror. Ella continued her daily routine of work and submission, but inside she was memorizing guard rotations, noting which horses were kept where, and slowly gathering the supplies she'd need for her desperate journey. A water skin here, some dried meat there, a small knife she managed to steal from the communal cooking area. Nothing too obvious, nothing that would be missed immediately. She also paid careful attention to the geography around the camp, noting which direction the sun rose and set, which way the streams flowed, and how the mountains aligned on the horizon. If she was going to navigate through unknown territory, she'd need every landmark she could remember. 3 nights before the new moon, Ella made her move. She waited until the camp was deep in sleep, then slowly worked her way out of her lodge. The night was cloudy, which helped hide her movements, but it also made navigation more and more difficult. She'd have to rely on her memory of the landscape and hope she was heading in the right direction. The hardest part was getting past the guards. Tahuros wasn't careless. He posted sentries around the camp's perimeter, and they took their duties seriously. But Ella had been observing them for weeks, and she knew their patterns. There was a brief window just before dawn when the night guards were tired and the day shift hadn't yet taken their positions. She moved like a ghost through the sleeping camp, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure it would wake the dead. Every shadow seemed to hide a watching eye, every sound might be a warrior reaching for his weapons. But somehow, impossibly, she made it to the edge of the camp without raising an alarm. The horses were kept in a natural corral formed by rock outcroppings and brush barriers. Ella knew she'd need a mount for the long journey ahead, but she also knew that stealing a horse would bring swift and terrible retribution. Still, she had no choice. On foot, she'd never outrun the pursuit that would surely follow. She chose a small mare, brown and unremarkable, hoping it wouldn't be missed as quickly as one of the finer animals. The horse nickered softly as she approached, but it didn't shy away. Ella whispered soothing words as she fashioned a simple rope halter and led the animal away from the corral. Only when she was a mile from the camp did she dare to mount up and urge the horse into a faster pace. Behind her, the Apache lodges grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely into the darkness. Ahead lay nothing but wilderness and the faint hope that she could reach her daughter before it was too late. The first day of her flight was a nightmare of constant fear and exhaustion. Every shadow might hide pursuing warriors. Every sound could be the thunder of hoofbeats closing in behind her. Ella pushed the mare as hard as she dared, following game trails and creek beds that offered some concealment from watching eyes. By nightfall, she estimated she'd put 20 miles between herself and Tahuros's camp. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough. But the horse was exhausted, and Ella herself was swaying in the saddle from fatigue and stress. She had to rest, even though every instinct screamed at her to keep moving. She found a small grove of cottonwoods near a stream and made a cold camp, not daring to light a fire that might be seen from a distance. The dried meat she'd stolen was tough and salty, but it gave her strength. The water from the stream was sweet and cold. As she sat in the darkness listening to the night sounds of the wilderness, Ella tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. The Lakota might kill her before she could explain why she'd come. Sarah might not even be in their camp. The young warriors could have been talking about some other white child. Tahuros might catch up to her before she reached her destination, but she also allowed herself just for a moment to imagine what it would be like to hold her daughter again, to feel those small arms around her neck, to hear Sarah's voice calling her mama. That hope, fragile as spun glass, was all that kept her going. On the second day, she saw the smoke. It was just a thin column rising in the distance, barely visible against the pale sky. But smoke meant people, and people in this part of the country could be either salvation or death. Ella studied the horizon through eyes gritty with fatigue, trying to decide whether to approach or find another route. The decision was made for her when she heard the war cries behind her. They came out of a fold in the hills like avenging spirits, 3 Apache warriors on fast horses with weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. Ella recognized one of them, Nalnish Tahuros's nephew, a young man known for his skill at tracking and his cruelty toward prisoners. There was no point in running. Her tired mare couldn't outpace fresh horses ridden by expert warriors. Instead, Ella did something that surprised even herself. She kicked the horse into a gallop and rode straight toward the smoke on the horizon, toward the unknown people who might be her salvation or her doom. Behind her, the war cries grew louder as her pursuers realized what she was doing. They couldn't risk an open attack if she reached another tribe's territory that could start a war they weren't prepared for. But they also couldn't let her escape to spread word of the planned raid. It became a desperate race across the broken landscape, with Ella's mare giving everything it had left, while the Apache warriors slowly closed the distance. Arrows began to whistle past her head, meant to wound or kill the horse rather than her. A dead captive was worthless, but a captive on foot could be easily recaptured. The smoke was getting closer now, and Ella could see the source, a small camp, nestled in a river valley with maybe a dozen lodges and horses grazing nearby. But more importantly, she could see people emerging from the camp to investigate the commotion. Warriors with weapons ready, women gathering children, close elders watching from the safety of the lodge entrances. And they were clearly not Apache. Ella had never been so glad to see strangers in her life. As her exhausted mare stumbled down the slope toward the camp, she began shouting in English, hoping someone would understand. "Help me, please. They're trying to take me back." The Lakota warriors, for that's what they were, she could tell from their dress. and the way they wore their hair formed a defensive line between her and her pursuers. Nalnish and the other Apache warriors pulled up short at the edge of the valley, their horses dancing nervously as they found themselves outnumbered and in enemy territory. One of the Lakota men stepped forward, an older warrior, with gray streaking his long hair and scars crisscrossing his chest. He spoke in Apache, his words carrying clearly across the distance between the two groups. Naalnish replied angrily, gesturing toward Ella with obvious frustration. The conversation went back and forth for several minutes, growing more heated with each exchange. Finally, the Lakota warrior made a cutting gesture with his hand, and Naalnish wheeled his horse around and rode away with his companions, but not before giving Ella a look that promised this wasn't over. The Lakota warrior turned to study Ella, his dark eyes taking in her ragged appearance, her stolen horse, and the obvious signs that she'd been living as a captive. When he spoke, it was in accented but clear English. "You are far from home, white woman." "Yes," Ella said, sliding down from her exhausted mare on shaking legs. "But I'm looking for someone, a little girl with yellow hair. She was taken from me 6 months ago, and I have reason to believe she might be here." Something shifted in the warrior's expression, a flash of recognition, perhaps, or surprise. He exchanged glances with some of the other men before looking back at her. "What is this child's name?" "Sarah," Ella whispered, hardly daring to hope. "Sarah Whitmore. She's 7 years old, and she's my daughter." The warrior was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to read the truth written there. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Come," he said. "There is someone you should meet." As they walked through the camp, Ella felt dozens of eyes following her every move. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, and warriors watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. But none of that mattered, because with every step her heart was beating faster with the possibility that her desperate gamble might actually have worked. They stopped in front of a lodge that was larger than the others, with symbols painted on its sides that Ella didn't recognize. The warrior called out something in Lakota, and after a moment the hide flap pushed aside. And there, blinking in the afternoon sunlight like a small ghost, was Sarah. She was thinner than Ella remembered, and her blonde hair had grown longer, reaching almost to her shoulders. Her skin was bronzed from months in the sun, and she wore a simple dress made of soft deerskin instead of the gingham frock she'd been wearing on that terrible morning when their world ended. But it was definitely, unmistakably, heartbreakingly Sarah. "Mama." The word came out as barely a whisper, as if the child couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. "Oh, baby," Ella sobbed, dropping to her knees and opening her arms. "Oh, my sweet baby girl." Sarah ran to her, then covering the distance between them in a few quick steps before throwing herself into her mother's embrace. Ella held her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and feeling the solid warmth of her small body. For the first time in 6 months, the world made sense again. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other and crying, while the Lakota people watched with expressions of understanding and sympathy. Many of them had lost children to raiders or disease, and they knew the pain of separation and the joy of reunion. Finally, the gray-haired warrior cleared his throat gently. "There are things we must discuss," he said. "But first, you should know the child has been well cared for. She is considered family here." "Thank you," Ella managed through her tears. "Thank you for keeping her safe." "She told us her mother was still alive," the warrior continued, "but the Apache who brought her said both parents were dead. We're not sure who to believe." "The Apache lied," Ella said firmly. "They kept me as a slave, and they separated us on purpose." The warrior nodded grimly. "This is their way. Create despair, break the spirit. But you are here now, and the child is returned to you. However, there is more you must know." He paused as if choosing his words carefully. "There is to be a raid. The Apache plan to attack this camp when the moon is dark. They seek to reclaim the child and—" he glanced at Sarah, who was still clinging to her mother's neck, "and to punish us for harboring her." Ella's blood turned to ice. When? 3 nights from now. 3 nights. She'd made it just in time, but barely. If she'd been even a day later, she might have arrived to find the camp destroyed and Sarah dead or taken back to the Apache. There's something else, Ella said urgently. Tahuros, their leader, he's planning something bigger than just a raid. I heard them talking about it. He wants to start a war between your people and others to drive all the whites out of the territory. This attack on your camp is just the beginning. The warrior's expression darkened. Tahuros. Yes, we know this name. He has caused much grief. He looked down at Sarah, who was listening to the adult conversation with the wide-eyed intensity that children bring to matters they don't fully understand, but know are important. What will you do? Ella asked. What we must, the warrior replied. Defend our people, but with warning comes advantage. You have given us a great gift by coming here, even at risk to yourself. As the sun began to set over the valley, Ella found herself sitting by a warm fire with Sarah curled up beside her, finally safe for the first time in months. But even as she held her daughter close, she couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Tahuros was planning his attack, and when he discovered that his captive had not only escaped, but had warned his enemies of his plans, his rage would know no bounds. The reunion she'd dreamed of for so long had finally come to pass. But Ella was beginning to understand that getting Sarah back was only the first step in a much longer, more dangerous journey. Still, for tonight, they were together. After 6 months of heartbreak and desperation, it was enough. It had to be enough, because tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The fire crackled softly in the gathering darkness, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. Ella sat with Sarah pressed against her side, marveling at how much her daughter had grown in the months they'd been apart. The child's hands were calloused now from work, and there was a wariness in her blue eyes that hadn't been there before, the look of someone who had learned too young that the world could be a dangerous place. Tell me what happened to you, baby, Ella whispered, stroking Sarah's long hair. Tell me how you survived. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When she spoke, her voice was smaller than Ella remembered, but steadier too. After they took me away from you, I cried a lot, she began. The scary man with the scars, he got angry when I cried. He said I was too loud, that I would bring soldiers, so they gave me to some other people, traders, I think, who brought me here. She paused, glancing up at the Lakota women who were preparing the evening meal nearby. The people here, they're not like the Apache. When I first came, I was so scared. I thought they would hurt me too, but Winona, she pointed to a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who was stirring a pot over the fire. She took care of me. She taught me their words and showed me how to work with the other children. Ella's throat tightened. Did anyone hurt you? No, Mama, they were good to me, but I missed you so much. Every night I would pray that you were still alive somewhere, that you would find me. Sarah's voice broke slightly. Sometimes I thought maybe you were dead, like that scary man said, but Winona told me to keep hoping. The woman Sarah had pointed to approached them, carrying a bowl of stew that smelled of meat and wild onions. She spoke in Lakota to Sarah, who responded haltingly in the same language. Then she turned to Ella. She says you must eat, Sarah translated. You look too thin. Winona nodded and added something else in Lakota, her tone gentle but firm. She says you are brave to come so far for your daughter, Sarah continued, and that courage needs strength. Ella accepted the bowl gratefully, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. The stew was rich and warming, unlike anything she'd tasted during her months of captivity. As she ate, she became aware that many of the Lakota people were watching her with curious but not unfriendly eyes. The gray-haired warrior who had first spoken to her approached and settled down beside the fire. In the flickering light, she could see that his face was deeply lined with age and weather, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. I am Akacheta, he said simply, war chief of this band. Your daughter has told us much about her family during her time here. She spoke of a father as well. Ella's heart clenched. Thomas, my husband. He was away when the Apache attacked our homestead. I don't know if he's alive or dead. The child believes he lives, Akacheta said, glancing at Sarah. She says he promised to come back for her. Papa's looking for us, Sarah said with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. I know he is. He promised he would never stop looking. Ella hoped her daughter was right, but she'd learned not to count on promises in this harsh land. Too many things could happen to a man traveling alone through hostile territory. We must speak of more immediate concerns, Akacheta continued. The Apache will come in 3 nights, as you have warned us. But there is something else you should know about Tahuros. The war chief's expression grew grave. He is not simply a raider seeking plunder. 5 winters ago, his youngest son was killed by cavalry soldiers during a flag of truce. Since then, he has sworn to drive all whites from Apache lands and to punish any tribe that aids them. Your presence here and the child's gives him the excuse he has long sought to attack us. Ella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. You're saying this is my fault, that by coming here I've brought war to your people. No, Akacheta said firmly. You brought warning. Without it we would have been caught defenseless. Many would have died, including your daughter. Now we have time to prepare. He stood and called out something in Lakota. Several younger warriors emerged from the shadows and gathered around the fire. Ella recognized the look in their eyes. She'd seen it in Thomas's face when he'd spoken of defending their homestead. These men were ready to fight. We will not run, Akacheta announced, speaking in English so Ella could understand. This is our land, our home. If Tahuros wants war, we will give it to him. One of the younger warriors, a man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, spoke up in rapid Lakota. Akacheta listened, then nodded grimly. Mape says there are stories from other camps. He translated. Tahuros has been gathering allies, promising them weapons and horses if they join his war against the whites. Some have already agreed. How many? Ella asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Perhaps 50 warriors, maybe more. Our band has only 20 men of fighting age. The odds were sobering, but Ella had learned something during her months of captivity. Sometimes survival wasn't about having superior numbers. Sometimes it was about being smarter, more determined, or simply more desperate than your enemies. There might be another way, she said slowly. Tahuros rules through fear and force. But what if his own people turned against him? Akacheta raised an eyebrow. Explain. Not all Apache support what he's doing. I heard them talking sometimes when they thought I couldn't understand. Some of the older warriors think his war will bring nothing but death to their people. And there are younger ones who question whether revenge is worth the price they'll all pay. She paused, remembering conversations she'd overheard during her captivity. There's a warrior named Naalnish, Tahuros's nephew. He's ambitious, and he doesn't like being under his uncle's shadow. If someone could convince him that Tahuros's war is doomed to fail, you think he would betray his own uncle? Mape asked in accented English. I think he would betray anyone if it meant advancing his own position, Ella replied. The question is how to reach him. Sarah, who had been listening intently to the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. What about the other white people? Everyone turned to look at her. What other white people, little one? Akacheta asked gently. The traders, Sarah said. When they brought me here, they talked about other white families in the territory, families that Tahuros hasn't found yet. If we could warn them... Ella's mind began racing. Sarah was right. There were other isolated homesteads scattered across the frontier families who had no idea that a war was brewing around them. If they could be warned, if they could be organized. How many families are we talking about? She asked. Akacheta was quiet for a moment, thinking. perhaps a dozen homesteads within 2 days' ride. Some single men, some families, all trying to build new lives in this hard country. And they have no idea what's coming. None. They live too far apart to share news easily, and few venture into our territory to trade. An idea was forming in Ella's mind, dangerous but possibly their only hope. What if we could bring them all together, unite them with your people against Tahuros? The Lakota warriors exchanged glances. The concept of whites and Indians fighting side by side was almost unthinkable. The two groups had been enemies for so long that cooperation seemed impossible. "It has never been done," Apache said finally. "Maybe that's why it might work," Ella replied. "Tahuros is counting on division, on fear and hatred, keeping everyone separated. He's not expecting unity." Mape leaned forward, his tattooed arms reflecting the firelight. "Even if such a thing were possible, how would we reach these scattered families in time, and why would they trust us enough to fight beside us?" Ella looked down at Sarah, who was watching the conversation with rapt attention. "Because I'll go to them. I'm white, they'll listen to me, and I have proof of what Tahuros is planning." "Absolutely not," Apache said firmly. "You have just escaped from captivity. You are exhausted, and you have your daughter to think of. I will not allow you to ride into danger again." "Then send someone with me," Ella insisted. "Someone who knows the country and can guide me to these homesteads. We only have 3 days. If we're going to do this, we have to start now." Sarah tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, I want to help too." "No, baby," Ella said quickly. "You're staying here where it's safe." "But what if you don't come back?" Sarah's voice was small and frightened. "What if the bad men take you away again?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Ella pulled her daughter closer, feeling the weight of the decision she was contemplating. She'd just found Sarah again. The thought of leaving her even temporarily was almost unbearable. But if they didn't act, if they didn't try to organize some kind of defense, they might all be dead in 3 days anyway. "I'll come back," she promised, hoping it was true. "I'll always come back for you." Winona, who had been listening to the conversation, even though she spoke little English, approached and said something in Lakota to Apache. The war chief nodded slowly. "Winona offers to care for your daughter while you are gone," he translated. "She says Sarah is like her own granddaughter now." Sarah looked up at the kind Lakota woman and managed a small smile. "I like Winona, Mama. She taught me how to make bread from corn." The simple statement nearly broke Ella's heart. Her little girl had learned to adapt, to find kindness, even in the midst of displacement and fear. If Sarah could be that brave, then Ella could be brave too. "All right," she said finally, "but I'm not going alone, and I'm not going unarmed." Apache studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Mape will go with you. He knows the country well, and he speaks some English, and—" He hesitated, then continued. "There is someone else who might join you, someone who knows the Apache ways better than any of us. A man who walks between worlds. Like you, he has reason to hate Tahuros. Like you, he has lost much to war and vengeance." Before Ella could ask what he meant, Apache rose and walked to the edge of the camp. He called out something in Lakota, his voice carrying across the valley. For a moment nothing happened. Then a figure emerged from the darkness beyond the firelight, a tall man moving with the fluid grace of a natural predator. As he stepped into the circle of light, Ella got her first clear look at him. He was Native American, but not Lakota. His clothing and the way he wore his hair marked him as different. He was perhaps 30 years old, with strong features and dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. There was something about him that suggested coiled strength, like a bow drawn but not yet released. But it was the expression on his face that caught Ella's attention. It was the look of a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and was carrying a burden of grief that threatened to crush him. "This is Cayenne Blackhawk," Apache said. "He is Lakota by birth, but he has lived among many tribes. He knows the Apache tongue and their ways of war." Cayenne stepped closer to the fire, and Ella saw that he bore old scars on his hands and arms, the marks of a warrior who had seen considerable battle. When he spoke, his English was flawless, without the accent that marked Akacheta's speech. "I know why you want to fight Tahuros," he said, looking directly at Ella. "But you should know that he is not just another war chief. He is clever, ruthless, and he has survived more battles than most men see in a lifetime. What you're proposing, uniting scattered homesteaders with Lakota warriors, it's never been done because it's nearly impossible." "Nearly impossible isn't the same as impossible," Ella replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "And right now, it's the only chance we have." Cayenne was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the firelight. "Why should I risk my life for strangers? What is it to me if a few homesteaders die in their beds?" The question was blunt, almost cruel, but Ella sensed that it wasn't meant to be unkind. This man was testing her, trying to understand what drove her to take such desperate risks. "Because if we don't stop Tahuros now, he won't stop with a few homesteaders," she said. "He'll keep killing until the whole territory runs red with blood, Indian and white alike. And because—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Because sometimes we have to choose who we want to be. We can be people who turn away when others need help, or we can be people who stand up and fight for what's right, even when the odds are against us." Cayenne looked at her for a long moment, then glanced at Sarah, who was watching him with the frank curiosity of childhood. "What is your name, little one?" he asked in a gentler tone. "Sarah Whitmore," she replied politely. "What's yours?" "Cayenne. It means hot pepper in the white man's tongue." Sarah giggled. "That's a funny name. My grandmother chose it because I had a fiery temper as a child," Cayenne said, and for the first time Ella saw something like warmth in his dark eyes. "I have learned to control that fire, but it still burns when I see injustice." He turned back to Ella. "You have courage, I will give you that. And your plan, while dangerous, is not entirely without merit. But even if we could unite the homesteaders with Akacheta's warriors, we would still be badly outnumbered." "Maybe," Ella said, "but we'd have the advantage of surprise. Tahuros is expecting to attack a defenseless Lakota camp. He's not expecting to face a coordinated resistance." Mape spoke up from across the fire. "There is something else to consider. If we can make Tahuros's first attack fail badly enough, his allies might lose faith in his leadership. Apache warriors follow strength. If he appears weak, they may abandon him." Cayenne nodded slowly. "That is true, and there are other considerations as well." He paused, as if debating whether to continue. "I have particular knowledge of Tahuros's methods, knowledge that might be useful in planning our defense." There was something in his tone that made Ella suspect there was more to his story than he was revealing. But she didn't press. Everyone in this hard country carried secrets, and most of them were painful. "So you'll help us?" she asked. "I will guide you to the homesteads," Cayenne said finally, "and I will fight beside you when the time comes. But I want you to understand what you're asking of these people. You're asking farmers and ranchers to stand against seasoned warriors. You're asking them to risk everything they've built for strangers they've never met." "I'm asking them to survive," Ella replied simply, "because if they don't fight, they'll die anyway, just not all at once." Cayenne studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "Very well. We leave at first light, but we must move quickly. 3 days is not much time to organize a resistance." As the evening wore on, they planned their route and discussed which homesteads to visit first. Akacheta provided them with 2 strong horses and supplies for the journey, while Winona prepared travel food and made sure Sarah had everything she needed. "I don't want you to go, Mama," Sarah whispered as Ella tucked her into the warm buffalo robes that would serve as her bed. "I know, sweetheart, I don't want to go either, but sometimes we have to do hard things to protect the people we love. Like Papa did when he went to town for supplies. The innocent question was like a knife in Ella's heart. Yes, baby. Like Papa. Will you bring him back with you? Ella's throat tightened. She wanted to promise, wanted to give her daughter the certainty she craved, but she'd learned the hard way that the frontier didn't honor promises or reward hope. I'll try, she said instead. I'll try to find him and bring him home. Sarah nodded solemnly, as if she understood that trying was all anyone could do in this unforgiving land. As the camp settled into sleep around them, Ella found herself staring up at the star-filled sky, thinking about the journey ahead. Tomorrow she would ride out again into uncertainty and danger, leaving behind the daughter she'd just found. It seemed like a cruel irony, but she was beginning to understand that survival often demanded impossible choices. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Thomas might still be searching for them. Somewhere out there, isolated families were sleeping peacefully, unaware that war was coming to their doorsteps. And somewhere out there, Tahuros was planning an attack that would either succeed in igniting a territory-wide conflict or fail spectacularly enough to end his reign of terror. In 2 days she would know which it would be, but for now she held her daughter close and tried to memorize the feeling of safety, however temporary it might be. Dawn came too soon, pale and cold in the eastern sky. Ella woke to find Cayenne already moving about the camp, checking their supplies and speaking quietly with Apache. In the growing light she could see him more clearly. He moved with the controlled economy of a man accustomed to danger, and there was something in his bearing that suggested he'd been a leader once, someone used to making life and death decisions. Sarah clung to her as they prepared to leave, and Ella had to fight back tears as she pried her daughter's small hands loose. "Be good for Winona," she whispered. "And remember, I will come back. Promise." Sarah's blue eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I promise." It was a promise she prayed she'd be able to keep. Cayenne was waiting with the horses, his expression unreadable in the morning light. As they rode out of the valley, Ella looked back once to see Sarah standing beside Winona, looking small and vulnerable against the vast landscape. Then they crested a rise and the camp disappeared from view. "The nearest homestead is about 6 miles northeast," Cayenne said as they settled into a steady pace. "A family named Henderson, man, wife, and 2 young sons. They've been here about a year trying to raise cattle. Will they listen to us? That remains to be seen. Frontier families tend to be suspicious of strangers, especially when those strangers bring warnings of danger." They rode in silence for a while, following game trails through country that grew increasingly rugged as they moved away from the river valley. The landscape was beautiful in its harsh way, rolling hills covered with sage and buffalo grass, distant mountains purple against the sky. But Ella knew that beauty could be deceiving in this land. Behind every ridge, danger might be waiting. "You said you have particular knowledge of Tahuros's methods," she said as they paused to rest the horses beside a small creek. "What did you mean?" Cayenne was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral, as if he were discussing the weather. 3 years ago, I led a war party against an Apache camp. We believed they had been raiding Lakota settlements, killing women and children. The evidence seemed clear: Apache arrows, Apache horses taken in the raids. He paused, staring across the water at the far bank. "We attacked at dawn as warriors do. We killed many, took scalps, counted coup. It was considered a great victory. But," Ella prompted gently, "but we had been deceived. The raiders weren't Apache at all. They were white men dressed as Indians trying to start a war between the tribes. The camp we attacked was peaceful, full of families just trying to survive another winter." His voice grew harder. "Among the dead was Tahuros's youngest son, a boy of perhaps 10 summers, and his wife who threw herself over the child to protect him." Ella felt a chill of understanding. "That's why he hates you, why he wants war." "That's why he has the right to hate me," Cayenne corrected. "I was the war leader. The decision was mine and the responsibility is mine." The fact that I was deceived doesn't change the blood on my hands." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither could cross. Ella found herself looking at this man with new eyes, seeing not just a guide and potential ally, but someone carrying a burden of guilt that might never lift. "So why are you here?" she asked. "Why help us fight him?" "Because," Cayenne said slowly, "sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to prevent more death. And because I've learned that running from your mistakes doesn't make them disappear, it just gives them time to grow into something worse." They remounted and continued their journey, but the conversation had changed something between them. The man riding beside her wasn't just a warrior seeking redemption. He was someone who understood the true cost of violence and was willing to pay almost any price to prevent more of it. The Henderson homestead appeared in the distance just as the sun reached its zenith. A small log cabin with an attached barn, a corral holding a few horses, and smoke rising from the chimney. It looked peaceful, prosperous, even a testament to the hard work and determination of people building new lives in an unforgiving land. But as they rode closer, Ella noticed details that spoke of the constant vigilance required for survival. The cabin had been built with its back to a rocky outcropping, eliminating one avenue of attack. The windows were small and high, making it difficult for enemies to see inside or shoot through them, and she could see rifle ports cut into the logs. This was a home built by people who understood that beauty and safety didn't always go hand in hand. A man emerged from the cabin as they approached, a rifle held casually but ready in his hands. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the weathered face and calloused hands of someone who worked hard for everything he had. Behind him, Ella could see a woman's face at one of the windows, and she knew there were probably children hidden safely inside. "That's far enough," the man called when they were still 50 yards away. "State your business." Cayenne raised his hand in the universal sign of peace, but he also made sure his own weapons were visible and ready. "We come with warning, John Henderson. There is danger approaching that threatens all who live in this territory." Henderson's eyes narrowed. "You know my name, but I don't know yours, and I don't recall inviting Indians to my land." There was no hostility in his voice, but no welcome either. This was a man who had learned to be careful, to trust slowly, and verify everything. "My name is Cayenne Blackhawk. This is Ella Whitmore. We ride from the Lakota camp in Bear Valley, and we bring word of an Apache war party that plans to attack in 2 days' time." "Apache?" Henderson's grip tightened on his rifle. "This is Lakota territory. Apache don't usually range this far north." "Usually, no," Cayenne agreed, "but these are not usual times. The war chief Tahuros seeks to drive all whites from the territory, and he plans to do it by attacking isolated homesteads and blaming the deaths on peaceful tribes. He wants to start a war that will consume everyone, Indian and white alike." Henderson studied them both carefully, his eyes lingering on Ella's worn clothing and the obvious signs that she'd been through hardship. "You're the woman whose family was attacked 6 months ago," he said suddenly. "Word reached us about the raid on the Whitmore place. You and your daughter were taken." "My daughter is safe," Ella said. "She's being cared for by the Lakota. But the Apache who took us, they're not finished. They're planning something bigger, and you're in their path." The cabin door opened and a woman stepped out, tall and lean, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to facing hardship head on. "John," she said quietly, "let them come closer. If they meant harm, they wouldn't have ridden up to us in broad daylight." Henderson hesitated, then lowered his rifle slightly. "Come ahead," he called, "but keep your weapons peace-tied." As they rode into the yard, Ella could see 2 young boys peering out from behind their mother's skirts, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, with their father's steady eyes and their mother's determined chin. "I'm Mary Henderson," the woman said, extending her hand to Ella as she dismounted. "You look like you've been through hell, child." "Something like that," Ella agreed, grateful for the woman's straightforward kindness. But I'm alive and so is my daughter. We're trying to make sure everyone else stays that way too. Mary nodded and turned to her husband. John, these people have ridden hard to bring us warning. The least we can do is hear them out. Over the next hour, sitting around the Hendersons' kitchen table with cups of real coffee, the first Ella had tasted in months, they laid out everything they knew about Tahuros's plans. They described the size of his war party, his methods of attack, and his ultimate goal of igniting a territory-wide conflict. "You're asking us to abandon everything we've built," Henderson said when they'd finished, "to leave our home and cattle and ride into the wilderness on the word of strangers." "No," Cayenne said, "we're asking you to help us build something better, an alliance between people who want to live in peace regardless of the color of their skin. Indians and whites fighting side by side." Mary Henderson shook her head. "John, I've heard of such things during the war back east, but out here we make our own rules," her husband finished. "The question is whether this alliance you're proposing would actually work or whether it would just get us all killed faster." Ella leaned forward. "Mr. Henderson, I've spent 6 months as a prisoner of the Apache. I've seen what Tahuros is capable of, and I've seen what happens to people who face him alone. But I've also seen what's possible when people choose cooperation over conflict." She told them about Sarah's treatment among the Lakota, about Winona's kindness and Akacheta's honor. She spoke of the bonds that could form between people who chose to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. "It's not about trusting strangers," she concluded. "It's about creating something new, a community that's stronger because it includes different kinds of people with different kinds of knowledge." Henderson was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim but resolved. "How many other families are you planning to approach?" "As many as we can reach in the time we have," Cayenne replied. "Perhaps a dozen homesteads within riding distance. And you think we can all reach this Lakota camp before the attack comes?" "If we move quickly, yes. And if we help each other along the way." Mary Henderson reached across the table and took her husband's hand. "John, remember what your father used to say about neighbors." Henderson smiled slightly. "That in hard country, your neighbors aren't just the people who live closest to you. They're the people who'll stand with you when trouble comes." "Exactly. And right now, these people are offering to be our neighbors." Henderson stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land he'd worked so hard to tame. "We'll need time to pack essentials and decide what to do about the livestock." "We can help with that," Ella offered. "And we can send word ahead to the next homestead. Let them know we're coming." "All right," Henderson said finally. "We'll come with you. But understand, if this turns out to be some kind of trap, if you're leading us into danger instead of away from it." "If we're wrong," Cayenne said quietly, "we'll all pay the price together. That's what neighbors do." As the Henderson family began preparations for their departure, Ella felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. They'd convinced one family to join them. It was a start. But they still had many miles to ride and many more families to convince before their desperate alliance could become reality. The sun was already moving toward the western horizon and time was running short. But for the first time since she'd escaped from Tahuros's camp, Ella began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they might actually have a chance. The Henderson wagon creaked and groaned as it rolled across the uneven prairie loaded with everything the family could carry from their homestead. John Henderson rode alongside on horseback, his rifle across his saddle, while Mary drove the team with their 2 boys pressed close beside her on the wagon seat. Behind them, smoke still rose from the cabin they'd called home for over a year, not from destruction, but from the fire Henderson had deliberately set in the hearth before leaving a signal to any who might follow that the place had been abandoned willingly. "Next homestead is the Kowalski place," Cayenne said, consulting the rough map Akacheta had drawn for them. "Polish family, been here about 8 months. They're trying to farm wheat, though the soil's not really suited for it. Ella rode beside him, her body aching from 2 days of hard travel, but her mind focused on the task ahead. Each family they approached meant another chance to build their unlikely alliance, but it also meant more time spent convincing skeptical strangers, while precious hours ticked away. "How many does that make so far?" Mary Henderson called from the wagon. "Including your family, we've got 16 people committed," Ella replied. "The Kowalskis would make it 21 if they agree to come." It had been a long day of riding from homestead to homestead, and the results had been mixed. The Morrison brothers, 2 bachelors trying to raise horses, had listened to their warning with growing alarm and agreed immediately to join them. An elderly couple named Phillips had taken more convincing, but the memory of their own losses during the Sioux uprising in Minnesota had finally swayed them. The Kellys, however, a young Irish family with 3 small children, had refused to abandon their newly built home, convinced that their isolation would protect them. "Some folks just can't see past their own fence lines," Henderson had muttered as they'd ridden away from the Kelly homestead, but Ella could see the worry in his eyes. Those children were the same ages as his own boys. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they approached the Kowalski farm, a modest affair, with a small sod house and a single barn that looked like it had been built more for optimism than practical use. The wheat fields that should have been golden with approaching harvest were sparse and stunted, testament to the harsh reality that not all dreams survive transplantation to frontier soil. A man emerged from the sod house as their small caravan approached, tall and lean, with the pale skin and light hair that marked him as recently arrived from eastern cities. He carried no weapon that Ella could see, which struck her as either remarkably trusting or dangerously naive. "Stefan Kowalski," Cayenne called out in greeting. "We bring news that concerns your safety and that of your family." The man approached cautiously, his eyes taking in the mixed group with obvious confusion. "I know you not," he said in heavily accented English. "Why you come to my farm?" Ella dismounted and stepped forward, recognizing on his posture the wariness of someone who had learned to be suspicious of unexpected visitors. "Mr. Kowalski, my name is Ella Whitmore. This is Cayenne Blackhawk, and these are the Henderson family. We're traveling to warn homesteaders about an Apache war party that's planning to attack settlements in this area." Kowalski's brow furrowed as he processed her words. "Apache, but this is far from Apache lands. Yes, we choose this place because it's safe from Indian troubles." "That's what Tahuros is counting on," Cayenne said grimly. "Isolated families who don't expect attack, who can't call for help when it comes." A woman appeared in the doorway of the sod house, small and dark-haired, with the kind of practical beauty that came from working hard and finding joy in simple things. She held a baby in her arms, and Ella could see 2 other small faces peering out from behind her skirts. "Stefan," the woman called. "Kosiajeya." "What's happening?" Kowalski turned and spoke rapidly in Polish, his voice growing more agitated as he explained what the strangers had told him. The woman's face paled and she clutched the baby more tightly. "My wife, Katerina," Kowalski said, turning back to them. "She asks why we should believe this story. How we know you not lie, try to steal our things." It was a fair question, and one that Ella had heard variations of at every homestead they'd visited. Trust was a precious commodity on the frontier, not given lightly to strangers bearing tales of danger. "Because I have nothing left to steal," Ella said simply. 6 months ago, I had a home, a husband, a daughter. The Apache took it all. Now I'm trying to make sure the same thing doesn't happen to anyone else." She pulled back her sleeves, revealing the rope burns and scars that marked her wrists, evidence of her captivity that couldn't be faked or explained away. "I know what Tahuros is capable of, Mr. Kowalski. I know what happens to families who face him alone." Mary Henderson climbed down from the wagon and approached Katerina Kowalski, speaking in the universal language that mothers used to communicate across barriers of culture and words. "How old is your baby?" she asked gently. "6 months," Katerina replied in halting English. "First child born in America." "She's beautiful," Mary said, and meant it. "My boys were born back in Ohio, but they consider themselves Westerners now. This land gets into your blood, doesn't it? Makes you want to fight for it." The two women began talking their conversation, moving between English and gestures, slowly building the kind of understanding that came from shared experience of frontier motherhood. Meanwhile, John Henderson and Stefan Kowalski examined the Polish farmer's weapons, a single old musket and a handful of shells that probably hadn't been fired in months. "This won't stop one Apache warrior, let alone a war party," Henderson said bluntly. "You need better weapons, and you need to know how to use them." "I am farmer, not soldier," Kowalski replied. "I come to America to grow crops, make peace life for family." "Peace is what we're trying to preserve," Cayenne interjected. "But sometimes you have to fight for peace, and sometimes you have to choose sides. Tahuros doesn't care that you're a farmer who wants no trouble. To him, you're just another white family to be eliminated." Kowalski was quiet for a long moment, looking at his wife and children, then at the stunted wheat fields that represented his hopes for the future. "If we come with you, what happens to farm to crops we planted?" "The crops are already failing," Henderson said, not unkindly. "I can see it from here. This isn't wheat country, friend, but that doesn't mean you can't build something else somewhere else. And if we stay, if we try to defend this place alone," Henderson's expression was grim, "then in 3 days your wife will be a widow and your children will be orphans, if they're lucky." The brutal honesty of the statement hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Katerina Kowalski had been listening to the conversation, and even with her limited English, she understood enough to make her opinion clear. "Stefan," she said firmly, "we go with these people. I not let children die for wheat that will not grow." Her husband nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "How long we have to pack?" "1 hour, Cayenne said. "Take only what you can carry. Food, blankets, weapons if you have them, medicine if you have any. Everything else stays behind." The next hour was a whirlwind of activity as the Kowalski family gathered their essentials while the Henderson boys helped load their wagon. Ella found herself helping Katerina pack clothes for the children, struck by how similar this moment was to her own hasty departure from the Lakota camp just days earlier. Always running, always leaving something behind, always hoping the next place would be safer than the last. "You have children?" Katerina asked as they folded tiny shirts and dresses. "A daughter," Ella replied. "She's 7 years old. She's safe now, but for 6 months I didn't know if she was alive or dead." Katerina nodded, understanding the weight of maternal fear that came with living in uncertain times. "Is hard be mother in this place. Always worry, always watch for danger." "But worth it," Ella said, thinking of Sarah's laughter when she'd seen her again. "For them, it's worth everything." As they prepared to leave the Kowalski homestead, Stefan took one last look at his failed wheat fields and the sod house that had sheltered his family through their first American winter. "I think maybe America is not what we expected," he said quietly. "It's exactly what I expected," Henderson replied. "Hard, dangerous, and unforgiving, but also full of possibilities if you're willing to work for them and fight for them." Their caravan had grown to 2 wagons and 8 riders as they continued northeast toward the next homestead. The Morrison brothers had joined them at midday, bringing their string of horses and their expertise in tracking and wilderness survival. Now the sun was getting low, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber, and they still had 3 more families to warn before they could turn back toward the Lakota camp. "We're cutting it close," Cayenne observed as they crested a hill and saw the next homestead in the distance. "If we're going to reach everyone and still get back to Bear Valley before the attack, we'll have to travel through the night." Ella studied the landscape ahead, noting how the terrain was becoming more broken and difficult as they moved further from the river valleys. What about the families who refuse to come? Do we just leave them? We give them the information and let them make their own choices. Henderson said firmly, "That's all we can do. Every man has the right to defend his own land in his own way, even if his way gets him killed." The Morrison brothers rode up beside them, their weather-beaten faces grim with shared knowledge. "That's the Dutton place ahead," the older one called Red said. "Family from Texas been here about 2 years. They've got more cattle than most, and they're not likely to abandon them easy." "Cattle can be replaced," Ella said. "Lives can't." "Try telling that to a Texas rancher," Red's younger brother Sam said with a bitter laugh. "They'd rather die fighting than run from a fight." The Dutton Ranch was larger and more prosperous than most of the homesteads they'd visited, with a substantial log house, multiple outbuildings, and corrals holding several dozen head of cattle. It was clear that this family had invested significant time and money in their frontier operation, which would make them all the more reluctant to abandon it. As they approached the main house, the door opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of bearing that suggested he was accustomed to command. He wore a revolver on his hip and carried himself like someone who knew how to use it. "That's far enough," he called when they were still 50 yards away. "State your business on my land." "James Dutton," Cayenne called back. "We come with warning of danger to all settlers in this territory." "I can handle my own dangers, thank you," Dutton replied. "Don't need help from Indians or anyone else." The hostility in his voice was immediate and obvious. This wasn't going to be like convincing the other families. Dutton had clearly made up his mind about Indians before they'd even spoken. "Mr. Dutton," Ella said, riding forward slowly, with her hands visible, "my name is Ella Whitmore. 6 months ago, my family was attacked by Apache raiders. They killed my husband and took me and my daughter prisoner." Something shifted in Dutton's expression, though his stance remained wary. "I heard about that attack. Word was that nobody survived. I survived, my daughter survived, and I've learned things about Apache plans that you need to know." A woman appeared beside Dutton on the porch, younger than him, with the kind of refined features that suggested she'd come from money and education. She placed a hand on his arm and spoke quietly, too low for them to hear. "My wife says I should at least listen to what you have to say," Dutton said finally, "but you can say it from right there, no need to come closer." Over the next 10 minutes, Ella and Cayenne laid out everything they knew about Tahuros's plans, the size of his war party, and his strategy of attacking isolated homesteads to provoke a wider conflict. They described the alliance they were building and the defensive plan they hoped to implement. When they finished, Dutton was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from them to the cattle grazing peacefully in his pastures. "Even if what you're saying is true," he said finally, "I've got 30 head of prime cattle here and buildings worth more than most men make in 5 years. I'm not abandoning all that on the word of strangers." "Those cattle won't do you much good if you're dead," Henderson said bluntly. "Maybe not," Dutton replied. "But running won't guarantee I stay alive either. At least here I've got walls, supplies, and position. Out there in the open I'd be just another target." His wife stepped forward and Ella could see the worry etched in her features. "James, what if they're right? What if this war chief really is planning to attack? Then we'll face him here on our own ground," Dutton said firmly. "I didn't come to Texas to run from fights, and I didn't come to Montana to start now." Ella could see that no amount of argument was going to change his mind. This was a man who had built his identity around standing his ground, and asking him to abandon that ground was asking him to abandon himself. "Mr. Dutton," she said finally, "I understand why you want to stay. This place represents everything you've worked for, but I've seen what Tahuros does to families who try to stand alone. Please at least send your wife and children away. Let them go with us while you defend your property." My place is with my husband, Mrs. Dutton said quietly but firmly. We came here together, and we'll face whatever comes together. There was no arguing with that kind of loyalty, even when it might prove fatal. Ella looked at the couple standing on their porch, united in their determination to defend their home, and felt a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. If you change your minds, Cayenne said, follow the North Star toward Bear Valley. You'll find us with the Lakota. And if we don't change our minds, Dutton replied, you'll know because you'll see the smoke from our guns when we make our stand. They left the Dutton ranch with heavy hearts, knowing they'd probably seen those brave, stubborn people for the last time. Behind them, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and red, painting the sky the color of blood and fire. 2 more homesteads, Cayenne said as they settled into a steady pace across the darkening prairie, the Schmidt family and old Pete Garrett. Then we turned back toward Bear Valley. Will we make it in time? Mary Henderson asked from the wagon. Cayenne studied the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. If we push hard and don't stop for more than brief rests, we should reach the camp by dawn the day after tomorrow. That gives us just a few hours before Tahuros attacks. It was going to be close, too close for comfort, but they'd come too far and risked too much to turn back now. The Schmidt homestead appeared out of the darkness, like a ship on a dark sea, its windows glowing with lamplight that spoke of family warmth and security. As they approached, Ella could hear the sound of children's laughter and a woman singing in what sounded like German. Nice sound, Stefan Kowalski said from his wagon. Reminds me of my grandmother's house in Old Country. The front door opened before they'd even dismounted, and a stout man with a graying beard stepped out, holding a lantern high to see who was approaching. Behind him, Ella could see a woman and several children watching from the doorway. Guten Abend, the man called out in German, then switched to accented English. Good evening. You travel very late. Is something wrong? Mr. Schmidt, Ella asked as she dismounted. We need to speak with you about a danger that threatens all the families in this area. Schmidt's expression grew serious as he studied their faces in the lamplight. Come inside, he said finally. Greta will make coffee and you can tell us what brings you to our door at such an hour. The Schmidt house was warm and welcoming, filled with the kind of comfortable clutter that came from a large family living in close quarters. 6 children ranging in age from perhaps 4 to 16 watched with wide eyes as the strangers filed into their main room while Mrs. Schmidt bustled about preparing coffee and setting out bread and cheese. Now then, Schmidt said once everyone was seated around the large wooden table he'd obviously built himself. What is this danger you speak of? They told their story once again, but this time something was different. Instead of skepticism or disbelief, the Schmidt family listened with the kind of attention that suggested they understood exactly what kind of threat they were describing. Apache war parties, the oldest Schmidt boy, perhaps 16, said when they'd finished. We heard stories about such things when we lived in Kansas. Whole families wiped out, buildings burned, livestock stolen. Which is why we came west, Schmidt said grimly, to get away from such troubles. But it seems troubles follow wherever people go. Mrs. Schmidt spoke up in rapid German, her voice urgent and worried. Her husband listened, then nodded slowly. Greta says she has felt something wrong for the past week, he translated. Animals acting strange, birds flying away from the south. She thinks maybe they sense danger coming. Animals often know things before people do, Cayenne agreed. They feel the tension, the wrongness in the air when violence is approaching. Schmidt looked around the table at his large family, his eyes lingering on each child's face. If we come with you, we travel with 6 children, including baby. We'll slow everyone down. We'll manage, Henderson said firmly. My boys can help with the younger ones, and we've got wagons for those who can't ride. And if we stay? Schmidt asked. The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Everyone knew the answer, but nobody wanted to say it out loud in front of the children. Papa, the oldest girl said quietly in English. Remember what you told us when we left Germany, that in America families help each other survive. Schmidt smiled at his daughter, pride evident in his expression. Ja, mein Liebchen. In America we become family with all good people, no matter where they come from. He stood and began moving around the room, gathering essential items with the efficiency of someone who had moved before and knew what was truly important. We pack now, travel light. Children, take only what you can carry in your arms. The next hour was organized chaos as the Schmidt family prepared for departure. Miss Schmidt packed food and medical supplies while the older children helped the younger ones choose which treasures to take and which to leave behind. Schmidt himself gathered tools and weapons, including an old military rifle that looked like it had seen service in European wars. I was soldier before I was farmer, he explained to Henderson as they loaded the Schmidt wagon. I know how to fight, but I also know when fighting is not enough. Their caravan had now grown to 3 wagons and a dozen riders stretching out across the prairie like a small army on the move. The children rode in the wagons, most of them sleeping despite the rough terrain, while the adults took turns standing watch and keeping the horses moving. One more stop, Cayenne said as they crested a ridge and saw a small cabin in the distance. Old Pete Garrett lives alone, keeps to himself mostly. If anyone's going to refuse to come with us, it'll be him. The Garrett place was little more than a shack with a small corral holding 2 old horses. No light showed in the windows, and for a moment Ella wondered if the place was abandoned. Then the door opened a crack and she could see the barrel of a rifle poking out. Who goes there? Came a gravelly voice from the darkness. Speak up or get shot. Pete Garrett, Cayenne called, son. It's Cayenne Blackhawk. I've got people with me who need to speak with you about Apache raiders heading this way. Blackhawk thought you were dead or gone to Canada. The door opened wider, revealing a grizzled old man with a white beard and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. What's this about Apache? They explained the situation once more, though Pete's questions were sharper and more pointed than those of the other families. This was a man who had survived on the frontier for decades, and he wasn't easily fooled or frightened. So you want me to abandon my home and ride off with a bunch of strangers to fight alongside Indians against other Indians, he said when they'd finished. That about sum it up. That's one way to put it, Ella said. Another way would be to say we're asking you to join a community of people who want to survive and build something better than endless cycles of violence. Pete studied her face in the lamplight, his rheumy eyes surprisingly sharp. You're the Whitmore woman. Heard about your troubles. Sorry for your loss. Thank you, Ella said quietly, but I didn't lose everything. I found my daughter and I found people willing to help strangers in need. That's worth fighting for. Pete was quiet for a long moment, looking around his shabby cabin and her meager possessions. Ain't got much to pack, he said finally, and ain't got much reason to stay neither. Reckon I'll throw in with you folks. Been alone too long anyway. It took Pete all of 15 minutes to gather his belongings, mostly consisting of his weapons, a few personal items, and a bottle of whiskey he claimed was for medicinal purposes. He saddled his best horse and turned his other animals loose, figuring they'd have a better chance surviving on their own than they would if Apache raiders found them in the corral. 30 years I've been in this country, he said, as they rode away from his cabin. Seen it change from wilderness to something resembling civilization. Hate to see it all burned down by men who think violence solves everything. Maybe it won't be, Henderson said. Maybe what we're building here will be the start of something different. Pete laughed, but it wasn't entirely bitter. Son, I've seen enough peace treaties broken and enough good intentions paved with blood to know better than to get my hopes up. But I've also seen enough miracles to know they sometimes happen when you least expect them. As they turned their growing caravan back toward Bear Valley, Ella found herself thinking about Pete's words. Maybe he was right to be cautious about hoping for too much, but she'd learned during her months of captivity that sometimes hope was all you had, and sometimes It was enough to keep you alive long enough for a miracle to find you. Behind them, scattered across miles of prairie, they'd left homesteads both empty and occupied. Some families had chosen to trust strangers and abandon everything they'd built for the chance of survival. Others had chosen to stand their ground and face whatever came alone. In a few hours, they'd all learn whether those choices had been wise or fatal. The moon was rising full and bright, casting silver light across the landscape and making travel easier but also more dangerous. Anyone tracking them would have no trouble following their trail, and a group their size couldn't move quietly even if they tried. "How far to the valley?" Mary Henderson asked from her wagon seat, her voice tight with exhaustion. Cayenne studied the stars and the landscape around them. "If we keep this pace, we should reach the outskirts by dawn. That gives us maybe 6 hours before Tahuros is scheduled to attack." 6 hours to prepare defenses, organize their mixed group of farmers and warriors, and somehow turn desperate people into an effective fighting force. It seemed impossible, but then again, everything about their situation seemed impossible. Maybe that was why it might actually work, because nobody, including Tahuros, would expect something so unlikely to succeed. As they rode through the silver night toward an uncertain dawn, Ella thought about Sarah sleeping safely in the Lakota camp, trusting that her mother would return as promised. It was a trust she intended to honor no matter what the next day might bring. The valley where it all began was calling them home, and with it, the final confrontation that would determine whether their desperate alliance could survive its first real test. Behind them lay scattered homesteads and the lives they'd all left behind. Ahead lay the unknown and the hope that sometimes courage and cooperation could triumph over hatred and fear. The night stretched on, filled with the sound of wagon wheels and horse hooves, carrying them toward their destiny. Dawn broke pale and cold over Bear Valley, as their weary caravan finally crested the last ridge before the Lakota camp. Ella's heart hammered against her ribs as she caught sight of the familiar tipis, below smoke rising from morning fires like prayers ascending to the sky. Somewhere down there, Sarah was probably just waking up, maybe helping Winona prepare breakfast, unaware that her mother was finally returning home. But the reunion would have to wait. Even as they descended into the valley, Ella could see the frantic activity that marked a camp preparing for war. Warriors moved between the lodges with purpose, checking weapons and gathering supplies. Children who would normally be playing were being kept close to their mothers. The very air seemed to vibrate with tension and anticipation. "Mama!" The cry cut through the morning air like a knife through silk. Sarah came running across the camp, her long blonde hair streaming behind her like a banner. Ella barely had time to dismount before her daughter threw herself into her arms, holding on with the desperate strength of someone who had feared this moment might never come. "Oh, baby," Ella whispered, breathing in the familiar scent of her daughter's hair. "I told you I'd come back." "I knew you would," Sarah said, her voice muffled against Ella's shoulder. Winona said brave mothers always keep their promises. Apache approached them, his weathered face showing relief at their safe return, but also grim determination as he surveyed the families they'd brought with them. "You have done well," he said to Ella and Cayenne, "but we have little time for reunions. Our scouts report that Tahuros is already moving. He will be here before the sun reaches its highest point." The next few hours passed in a blur of desperate preparation. The homesteader families were assigned places to shelter their children and elderly, while the men who could fight were given weapons and quick lessons in defensive tactics. The Schmidt boys, despite their youth, proved surprisingly capable with rifles, their father's military training having been passed down through family instruction. "Remember," Henderson called to his fellow farmers, as they took positions behind hastily constructed barricades, "we're not trying to win a glorious victory here. We're trying to survive and protect our families. Stay low, make every shot count, and don't try to be heroes." Ella found herself positioned near the center of the camp's defenses, armed with a rifle she barely knew how to use, but determined to learn quickly. Sarah had been placed in one of the most protected areas with the other children and non-combatants, though the little girl had protested fiercely about being separated from her mother again. "You stay with Winona and keep the other children calm," Ella had told her firmly. "That's your job in this fight, and it's just as important as anything the rest of us are doing." Cayenne moved through the defensive positions like a ghost, checking sightlines and making adjustments to their placement. His knowledge of Apache tactics was proving invaluable, as he anticipated how Tahuros would likely approach the attack. "He'll try to stampede the horses first," he explained to Mape and the other Lakota warriors. "Create chaos and confusion. Then he'll hit us from multiple directions, trying to break our line and get to the women and children." "And how do we stop him?" asked Red Morrison, checking the loads in his rifle for the third time. "We don't panic," Cayenne said simply. "We stick to our positions, support each other, and make him pay dearly for every yard he advances. If we can hold long enough and inflict enough casualties, his allies may decide this war isn't worth the cost." Mape pointed toward the eastern ridge where their lookouts were posted. "They come," he said quietly. The Apache war party appeared on the ridge like a dark storm cloud silhouetted against the morning sky. Even at a distance, Ella could make out the distinctive figure of Tahuros on his black stallion, his scarred face turned toward the valley where his escaped prisoner had found sanctuary. 40 warriors, maybe more," Akacheta observed through a military telescope one of the homesteaders had brought. "Some are not Apache. Looks like Tahuros has convinced allies from other tribes to join him." "That makes our job harder," Henderson said grimly. "More warriors means more pressure on our defenses." "But also more different fighting styles," Cayenne countered tempered. "Apache fight one way, Comanche another, Kiowa still another. They may not coordinate as well as a single tribe would." The war party began its descent into the valley, spreading out in a crescent formation designed to strike multiple points simultaneously. Their war cries echoed off the canyon walls, a sound calculated to freeze the blood and weaken the resolve of their enemies. But the defenders didn't break. Farmers and warriors alike held their positions, fingers steady on triggers, eyes fixed on the approaching threat. The children in the protected areas stayed remarkably quiet, as if they understood that their very lives depended on remaining unseen and unheard. "Hold your fire until they're in range," Akacheta called out. "Make the first volley count." The distance closed with agonizing slowness. Ella could see individual faces now among the attackers, paint-streaked warriors she recognized from her months of captivity. Some looked eager for battle, others merely determined. All of them looked ready to kill or die for their war chief's vision of driving the white settlers from Apache lands. Tahuros himself rode in the center of the formation, his presence lending courage to his followers and striking fear into his enemies. As he drew closer, Ella could see the cold fury in his scarred face, the absolute certainty that he was fighting a righteous war against invaders who deserved nothing but death. 200 yards, Cayenne called out softly. "Still too far for most of us." 150. 100. The world seemed to hold its breath as the two forces approached the moment of collision. Ella's hands were steady on her rifle, but her heart was racing so fast she feared it might burst from her chest. Somewhere behind her, Sarah was hiding with the other children, trusting that the adults would protect them from the violence about to unfold. 50 yards, Akacheta said, raising his own rifle. "Fire!" The valley erupted in smoke and thunder as the defenders' first volley crashed into the advancing war party. Several Apache warriors tumbled from their horses, while others wheeled away, surprised by the volume and accuracy of the defensive fire. But Tahuros didn't retreat. Instead, he raised his lance high and let out a war cry that seemed to shake the very mountains. His remaining warriors regrouped and charged forward with renewed fury, spreading out to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The battle became a chaotic maelstrom of smoke, gunfire, and screaming horses. Ella found herself firing and reloading with mechanical precision, barely aware of whether her shots were finding their targets. Around her, farmers and warriors fought side by side, their differences forgotten in the desperate struggle for survival. "They're trying to flank us on the left," Henderson shouted over the din of battle. Mape and several Lakota warriors rushed to reinforce that section of their line, their traditional weapons proving just as effective as the settlers' rifles in close combat. The fighting was fierce and personal, with men grappling hand to hand when ammunition ran low or weapons jammed. Through the smoke and chaos, Ella caught glimpses of individual dramas playing out across the battlefield. She saw Stefan Kowalski standing over his fallen horse, using it as cover while he methodically worked his old musket. She saw young Tom Schmidt, barely 16, helping his wounded father reload, while tears streamed down his dirt-stained face. And everywhere she saw the deadly grace of Cayenne Blackhawk as he moved through the battle like an avenging spirit. He seemed to anticipate every Apache move, appearing wherever the defense was weakest, turning potential breakthroughs into costly failures for the attackers. But for all their courage and determination, the defenders were slowly being worn down. They were outnumbered and outgunned, fighting a defensive battle against seasoned warriors who had been raiding and fighting for most of their adult lives. "We can't hold much longer," Pete Garrett called out, his voice hoarse from shouting orders and breathing gun smoke. "They're going to break through somewhere." As if his words had been prophetic, a group of Apache warriors suddenly burst through a gap in the defensive line, heading straight for the area where the non-combatants were sheltered. Ella's blood turned to ice as she realized that Sarah and the other children were directly in their path. Without thinking, she abandoned her position and ran after the warriors, her rifle forgotten as maternal instinct overrode tactical sense. Behind her, she could hear Cayenne shouting her name, but she didn't stop. Nothing in the world mattered except reaching her daughter before the Apache did. She burst into the shelter area just as the first warrior was raising his tomahawk over a cowering group of children. Sarah was there, pressed against Winona's side, her blue eyes wide with terror, but not panic. The little girl had learned something about courage during her months among the Lakota. "Get away from them!" Ella screamed, throwing herself at the warrior with nothing but rage and desperation as weapons. The collision sent both of them tumbling to the ground, the warrior's tomahawk spinning away into the darkness. He was stronger than Ella and recovered first, pinning her beneath his weight as his hands closed around her throat. But Sarah hadn't been idle. With the quick thinking that children sometimes display in crisis, she had grabbed a burning brand from the fire and thrust it into the warrior's back. He roared in pain and rolled away from Ella, giving her time to scramble toward a fallen rifle. The weapon was heavy and unfamiliar in her hands, but she managed to get it pointed in the right direction just as the warrior recovered and charged toward her again. The shot took him in the chest at point-blank range, the impact throwing him backward into the shelter wall. More Apache warriors were pouring into the area, but now they faced not just terrified civilians, but a mother defending her child. Ella worked the rifle's action with desperate efficiency, firing as fast as she could reload, while Sarah and the other children huddled behind overturned furniture. Then suddenly Cayenne was there, moving through the Apache warriors like a force of nature. His rifle spoke again and again, each shot precisely placed, each target eliminated with professional efficiency. Behind him came Mape and several other Lakota warriors, their arrival turning the tide in the shelter area. But even as they drove back this attack, Ella could hear the sounds of fighting intensifying throughout the camp. The main battle was reaching its climax, and she had no idea whether their desperate alliance would be strong enough to prevail. "Sarah, stay close to me," she said, pulling her daughter against her side as they moved back toward the main defensive line. "Are we going to die, Mama?" Sarah asked with the directness that only children possessed. "Not today, baby. Ella replied with more confidence than she felt. Not today. The main battle line was barely holding when they returned to it. Several of the homesteader men were down wounded or worse, and ammunition was running dangerously low. But the Apache had paid a heavy price for their assault, with many warriors lying motionless on the valley floor. Tahuros himself had finally entered the fight, directly his black stallion carrying him through the defensive positions like a dark whirlwind. His lance and war club had claimed several lives, and his very presence seemed to inspire his remaining warriors to greater efforts. "Someone needs to stop him," Henderson gasped, blood streaming from a scalp wound. "As long as he's leading them, they'll keep fighting." Cayenne heard the comment and looked across the battlefield to where the Apache war chief was rallying his forces for another assault. For a moment his eyes met Ella's, and she saw something pass across his face, a look of resignation mixed with determination. "Cayenne, no," she said, understanding what he was planning. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," he replied quietly. "This ends where it began, between him and me." Before anyone could stop him, Cayenne stepped out from behind the barricades and walked into the open ground between the two forces. His rifle lay forgotten behind him. He carried only his traditional weapons now, the tools of a Lakota warrior facing his destiny. "Tahuros," he called out in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "I am Cayenne Blackhawk, the one who killed your son. Face me now and let this blood debt be settled between warriors." The fighting gradually died away as both sides realized what was happening. This was no longer just a battle between raiders and defenders. It had become something older and more primal, a confrontation between two men whose fates had been intertwined by tragedy and misunderstanding. Tahuros dismounted from his stallion and walked forward to meet Cayenne in the center of the battlefield. The scarred war chief's face showed no emotion, but Ella could see the tension in his posture, the coiled readiness of a predator about to strike. "You speak my language well for a dog," Tahuros said when they were close enough to converse without shouting. "Do you also know the words for begging?" "I know the words for sorrow," Cayenne replied steadily, "and for justice and for the end of cycles that serve no one." "My son is dead because of you," Tahuros snarled. "My wife is dead because of you. There can be no end until you join them in the spirit world." The two warriors began to circle each other like wolves, each looking for an opening, an advantage, a moment of weakness to exploit. Around them the entire battlefield had gone silent except for the sound of wind through the valley and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. Tahuros struck first, his war club whistling through the air with deadly precision. But Cayenne was ready, deflecting the blow with his own weapon while simultaneously striking back with his knife. The Apache leader twisted away the blade, missing his throat by inches. The fight was brutal and primitive, two skilled warriors using weapons that their ancestors had carried into battle for countless generations. There were no rules except survival, no judges except death, no mercy except what the victor chose to show. Cayenne was younger and perhaps more agile, but Tahuros had the advantage of consuming rage that had burned in him for 3 years. Every strike he threw carried the weight of his grief. Every block and counterstrike was powered by his need for revenge. Blood began to flow as both men landed, telling blows. Cayenne took a glancing strike from the war club that opened a gash on his shoulder, while Tahuros received a knife cut across his ribs that sent crimson streaming down his side. "Your son was innocent," Cayenne said, between attacks, his breath coming in short gasps. "But so were the children in that camp. So are the children hiding behind us now." "There are no innocent white children," Tahuros replied, pressing his attack with renewed fury. "They grow up to be soldiers and settlers who steal our lands and kill our people." "Some do," Cayenne agreed, barely avoiding a skull-crushing blow. "But some grow up to be peacemakers, teachers, healers. You would kill them all for the crimes of the few." The philosophical debate continued even as they fought, each man trying to justify his position while simultaneously trying to end his opponent's life. Around them, the watching warriors and settlers began to understand that this was about more than personal revenge. It was about the future of the entire territory. Tahuros's next attack was his most vicious, yet a combination of war club and knife that should have ended the fight. But Cayenne somehow managed to slip inside the Apache's guard, his own knife finding its way between ribs to pierce the war chief's heart. For a moment, both men stood frozen in tableau, Tahuros's eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been relief. Then his weapons fell from nerveless fingers, and he collapsed to his knees in the dusty earth of the valley floor. "Tell me," he whispered as his life ebbed away. "Tell me my son's death meant something." Cayenne knelt beside his fallen enemy, his own wounds forgotten in the face of the dying man's plea. "His death taught us that hatred breeds only more hatred," he said gently. "That might be the most important lesson any child ever taught." Tahuros nodded once, then fell forward into the dust. His long war finally ended. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. The Apache warriors who had followed their war chief into battle now faced a choice: continue fighting for a dead man's vision or accept that perhaps there was another way forward. It was Nyalnish Tahuros's ambitious nephew who broke the silence. He stepped forward from the Apache ranks, his weapons lowered, his expression unreadable. "My uncle is dead," he announced in clear English. "The blood debt he claimed has been paid. I see no honor in continuing this fight." One by one, the other Apache warriors began to lower their weapons as well. Some looked relieved, others confused, but none seemed willing to continue the battle without their charismatic leader to guide them. Akecheta stepped forward from the defenders' lines, his own weapons peace-tied as a sign of good faith. "There has been enough death in this valley," he said formally. "Let the spirits of the fallen find rest, and let the living find a way to share this land in peace." Nalnish nodded slowly. "My uncle believed that whites and Indians could never live together. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps it is time to try a different path." The formal end to hostilities took several hours to negotiate, with both sides wary of treachery, but exhausted by the costs of conflict. In the end, they agreed to a truce that would allow the Apache to withdraw with their wounded, while the defenders tended to their own casualties and began the process of rebuilding. But for Ella, the most important moment came when Sarah ran across the battlefield to throw her arms around her mother's waist. "Is it over, Mama?" the little girl asked, looking around at the scattered weapons and the men tending wounded on both sides. "The fighting is over," Ella said carefully, "but the building is just beginning." As the sun began to set over Bear Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the unlikely alliance that had formed to face Tahuros's war party began to discuss what came next. The homesteader families couldn't return to their scattered claims, not immediately, but perhaps they didn't need to. "What if we stayed together?" Mary Henderson suggested as they gathered around the evening fires. "What if we built a real community here, one where families could help each other and children could grow up safely, whites and Indians living in the same settlement?" Pete Garrett shook his grizzled head. "That's never been done before." "Maybe it's time it was done," Stefan Kowalski said quietly. "Maybe it's time for new ways in new country." Akecheta looked around the circle of faces, farmers and warriors, children and elders, people who had been strangers a few days earlier but who had now bled together in defense of their shared future. "The valley is large enough for many families," he said thoughtfully, "and there is strength in numbers, protection, and unity. Perhaps the spirits have brought us together for a purpose larger than any of us imagined." Cayenne, his shoulder bandaged but his spirit seemingly lighter than it had been in years, nodded slowly. "I've spent 3 years running from the consequences of my mistakes," he said. "Maybe it's time to stop running and start building something better." Ella looked around the circle and saw hope beginning to kindle in faces that had known too much fear and loss. It wouldn't be easy, nothing worthwhile ever was on the frontier. There would be challenges, setbacks, conflicts to resolve, and prejudices to overcome. But for the first time since that terrible morning when the Apache had destroyed her homestead, Ella could envision a future that held something more than mere survival. She could see Sarah growing up in a community where difference was a source of strength, rather than divisions, where children learned from multiple traditions and cultures, where families supported each other regardless of the color of their skin or the accent of their speech. It was an ambitious dream, perhaps an impossible one. But then again, everything they had accomplished in the past few days had seemed impossible when they started. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ella held her daughter close and allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they had planted the seeds of something truly remarkable in this remote valley where strangers had become family and enemies had learned to lay down their weapons in favor of building something better together. The morning after the battle dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the grass where blood had been spilled just hours before. Ella woke to find Sarah curled against her side in the buffalo robes that Winona had provided her daughter's breathing, deep and peaceful despite everything they'd endured. For a moment she allowed herself to simply lie still and listen to the sounds of the camp awakening around them, voices speaking in different languages, children laughing, the clatter of cooking pots and the whinny of horses. It was the sound of people choosing to live rather than merely survive. "Mama," Sarah's voice was soft with sleep. "Did we really win?" Ella considered the question carefully. Around them, both Apache and settler wounded were being tended by whoever had the skills to help, regardless of which side they'd fought on. The dead from both forces had been laid out with equal dignity, awaiting burial ceremonies that would honor the beliefs of their respective peoples. "We didn't win a war, baby," she said finally, "but maybe we won something more important. Maybe we won a chance to try something different." Sarah sat up and looked around the camp with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Are the Apache people going to stay here too?" "Some of them might," Ella replied, thinking of the conversations that had continued late into the night around the council fires. "It's complicated, sweetheart. Some people on both sides still have a lot of anger and hurt to work through. Not everyone was ready to embrace the radical notion of a mixed community. Several of the Apache warriors had ridden away during the night, unwilling to consider any future that involved cooperation with white settlers. Similarly, 2 of the homesteader families had expressed serious doubts about the wisdom of staying in a place where former enemies might become neighbors. But others had stayed drawn by the possibility of something unprecedented in the history of the American frontier. Cayenne approached their sleeping area, his arm in a sling but his step steady. The events of the previous day had changed something fundamental in his. Bearing the weight of guilt he'd carried for 3 years seemed lighter, replaced by a sense of purpose that Ella found both inspiring and attractive. "The council is gathering," he said quietly. "Echecheta wants to discuss the practical matters of how this settlement might work if we decide to move forward." Ella nodded and began helping Sarah dress for the day. "Are you ready for this?" she asked Cayenne. "Leading people is different from fighting." "I'm not sure I'm meant to lead anyone," he replied, "but I am sure that what we're attempting here matters more than anything I've done in my life." The council gathering was held in the center of the camp, with representatives from each family and tribal group forming a rough circle around a central fire. The morning sun cast long shadows across their faces as they grappled with questions that no frontier community had ever been forced to address. "The first matter is land." Echecheta began speaking in English so that everyone could understand. "This valley has been Lakota hunting grounds for many generations, but it is large enough to support farming as well as traditional uses." John Henderson leaned forward, his practical mind already working through the logistics. We'd need to survey the land, establish clear boundaries. Some areas better suited for crops, others for grazing, still others left wild for hunting. "And what about the law?" asked Mary Henderson. "As far as the territorial government is concerned, this is still Indian land. White settlement here might not be legal." Pete Garrett spat into the fire, sending up a small hiss of steam. "Government's pretty far away from here, Missy. By the time they figure out what we're doing, we'll be too established to move." "That's a dangerous assumption," Cayenne warned. "If we're going to build something lasting, we need to do it right. That means finding ways to make our settlement legal under both tribal law and territorial law." Stefan Kowalski raised his hand tentatively. "In old country, I hear stories of communities where different peoples live together. Sometimes works, sometimes not. Question is what makes difference." It was Winona who answered, speaking slowly in her careful English. "Respect," she said simply. "When people respect each other's ways, when children learn from all traditions, when no one thinks their way is only way, that is when different peoples can become one people." Sarah, who had been sitting quietly beside her mother, suddenly spoke up. "Like a garden," she said. "Different plants growing together make the garden stronger." The adults looked at the 7-year-old with surprise, and then Akacheta smiled. "The child speaks wisdom. Different strengths growing together, roots intertwined, each plant helping the others survive." "Pretty words," said Tom Morrison Red's younger brother. "But what happens when the first real conflict comes up? When someone's cow gets into someone else's corn, or when traditions clash, or when outside pressure forces us to choose sides?" It was a sobering question, and one that hung in the morning air like smoke from the fire. Everyone knew that the harmony of the moment was fragile, built on shared danger and mutual exhaustion rather than deep understanding. "We'll face those problems when they come," Henderson said finally. "But running away from the possibility of conflict means giving up the possibility of something better. And we already know what the alternative looks like," added Ella, gesturing toward the battlefield where yesterday's violence had played out. "We've all seen what happens when fear and hatred drive decisions. Maybe it's time to try letting hope drive them instead." The discussion continued through the morning, touching on everything from governance structures to economic arrangements to the education of children. It became clear that what they were contemplating was nothing less than the creation of an entirely new kind of American community, one that drew strength from diversity rather than seeing difference as a threat. By midday, they had reached a tentative agreement to attempt a 1-year trial of shared settlement. Those who wanted to participate would work together to establish homes and farms in the valley, sharing resources and responsibilities while maintaining their distinct cultural identities. At the end of the year, they would evaluate whether the experiment was worth continuing. "It's not perfect," Henderson admitted as they prepared to break up the council, "but it's a start." "All great journeys begin with a single step," replied Cayenne. "The question is whether we have the courage to keep walking even when the path becomes difficult." As the adults dispersed to begin the practical work of planning their settlement, Ella found herself walking toward the area where the wounded were recovering. Among them was Nalnish Tahuros's nephew, who had taken an arrow in the shoulder during the final charge. "How are you feeling?" she asked, settling down beside his makeshift bed. The young Apache warrior studied her with dark eyes that held wariness but not hostility. "Like a man who has lost his way and is trying to find it again," he said in careful English. "We're all trying to find our way," Ella replied. "Maybe we can help each other do it." Nalnish was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the skies where clouds were beginning to gather in the west. "My uncle believed that your people and mine could never live in peace," he said finally. "He had reasons for that belief, good reasons, born from much pain and loss." "But he was wrong about some things too," Ella said gently. "Pain and loss don't have to define our futures unless we let them." "You speak like someone who knows about pain and loss." Ella thought of Thomas, her husband, who might still be alive somewhere searching for his family, with no idea where to find them. She thought of her destroyed homestead, her months of captivity, the terror of nearly losing Sarah forever. "I do know about them," she said, "but I also know about the healing that's possible when people choose to help each other instead of hurt each other." Nalnish nodded slowly. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps it is time to try a different path." He paused, then added, "I have skills that might be useful to your settlement. I know the country, the plants that can be eaten, the animals that can be hunted. I know which streams run year-round and which go dry in summer." "Those would be valuable contributions," Ella agreed. "But the decision to stay has to be yours. It won't be easy building something new with people who were enemies just yesterday." "Nothing worthwhile is ever easy," Nalnish replied, and Ella heard an echo of Cayenne's words in the young warrior's voice. Over the following days, the work of building their new community began in earnest. Trees were felled and trimmed for construction, gardens were planned and marked out, and the first foundations were laid for cabins that would house the mixed families through the coming winter. The work was hard, but it brought people together in ways that formal negotiations never could. When Stefan Kowalski struggled to raise the walls of his new cabin, Mapi and 2 other Lakota warriors appeared with tools and muscle to help. When Winona fell ill with a fever, Mary Henderson sat by her bedside for 3 days, tending her with the same care she would have shown her own mother. Children adapted fastest of all, as children always did. Sarah quickly became friends with the Schmidt boys, and several Lakota children her age, creating games that blended elements from all their cultures. Language barriers seemed to dissolve in the face of childhood's universal desire to play and explore. "Look, Mama," Sarah said one evening, showing Ella a doll that one of the Lakota girls had made for her. "Morning Star taught me how to braid grass, and I taught her how to make mud pies like we used to do back home." The casual way Sarah had said "back home" struck Ella like a gentle blow. To her daughter, this valley was already becoming home in a way their isolated homestead had never quite managed to be. But not everything was progressing smoothly. Cultural misunderstandings arose daily, from disagreements about hunting protocols to confusion over marriage customs, to conflicts about child-rearing practices. Each issue required careful negotiation and patient explanation, testing the community's commitment to mutual respect. The most serious crisis came in the 3rd week, when Tom Morrison shot and killed a deer that had been wounded and tracked by one of the Lakota hunters. According to Lakota tradition, the deer belonged to whoever had first wounded it, but Morrison claimed that since he'd made the killing shot, the meat was his. The argument quickly escalated, drawing in family members and tribal affiliations until the entire community was polarized along racial lines. For a tense afternoon, it seemed as though the fragile alliance might shatter over something as simple as hunting etiquette. It was Cayenne who proposed a solution that satisfied both parties. The deer would be shared equally among all families, but future hunting would be governed by clearly established rules that respected both traditional protocols and practical necessities. "This is how we learn," he told the assembled community as they worked together to butcher and distribute the meat. "Not by avoiding conflicts, but by finding ways to resolve them that honor everyone's dignity. And by remembering that we're stronger together than we are apart," added Akacheta, his weathered hands working alongside those of farmers and warriors to prepare the evening meal. As autumn deepened into winter, the settlement began to take on a more permanent character. Cabins were completed and furnished gardens were harvested and food preserved for the cold months ahead. Children started attending impromptu schools where they learned reading and arithmetic from the homesteader women, while also receiving instruction in traditional crafts and stories from the Lakota elders. But the question that haunted Ella through all these hopeful developments was the fate of Thomas. She had sent word of their location to every trading post and settlement within 100 miles, hoping that if her husband was still alive, he might hear that his family had been found. So far, there had been no response. "He could be anywhere," Cayenne said one evening as they sat by the fire outside Ella's cabin. Over the weeks, he had become her closest friend and confidant, the person she turned to when doubts and fears threatened to overwhelm her optimism about their community's future. "I know," she replied, watching Sarah play with the other children in the firelight. "But not knowing is almost worse than knowing for certain that he's dead. At least then I could mourn and move on." "And if he is alive?" Cayenne asked quietly. "If he comes here and finds you building a new life in a place he never imagined?" It was a question Ella had been avoiding, but one that demanded an answer. Her feelings for Cayenne had grown beyond friendship over the past months, though neither of them had spoken openly about it. The possibility of Thomas's return complicated everything. "Then we'll face that challenge the same way we've faced all the others," she said finally, "with honesty, respect, and hope that love is stronger than the misunderstandings that divide us." The first real test of their community's strength came with the early winter when a band of territorial marshals arrived to investigate reports of illegal settlement on Indian lands. The 6 armed men rode into the valley with the kind of casual arrogance that came from representing distant authority, clearly expecting to find either a nest of outlaws or a group of naive settlers who could be easily intimidated. What they found instead was something unprecedented in their experience, a thriving community where Indians and whites worked side by side, where children of different races played together, where traditional teepees stood alongside log cabins in harmonious disorder. "Which one of you is in charge here?" demanded the lead marshal, a heavy-set man with a badge pinned to his coat and suspicion written across his features. "We all are," replied Henderson, stepping forward as the elected spokesman for the settlement. "This is a cooperative community marshal. Everyone has a voice in decisions." "Cooperative community," the marshal repeated with obvious skepticism. "That's a fancy name for squatting on Indian land without proper authorization." Akecheta approached the group of lawmen with the dignity of a chief greeting foreign dignitaries. "This is Lakota land," he said formally. "These people are here by invitation as our guests and partners." "Indians can't grant land rights," another marshal said dismissively. "Only the territorial government can do that, and we have no record of any authorized settlement in this area." The confrontation might have escalated into violence, but Cayenne stepped forward with a leather portfolio that he'd been preparing for just such an occasion. "Actually, Marshal, you might want to examine these documents before making any hasty decisions." The papers he produced were a mixture of territorial law citations, federal Indian policy statements, and carefully researched precedents for cooperative arrangements between settlers and tribal groups. It was a legal argument that would probably require territorial courts to resolve, but it was substantial enough to give the marshals pause. "This is irregular," the lead marshal admitted after studying the documents. "I'll need to consult with my superiors before taking any action." "You're welcome to stay and observe our community while you wait for instructions," Ella offered. "We have nothing to hide, and perhaps you'll see that what we're building here benefits everyone." The marshals remained for 3 days, and their initial skepticism gradually gave way to grudging admiration for what the settlement had accomplished. They saw former enemies working together to build homes and farms. They witnessed conflicts being resolved through discussion rather than violence, and they observed children growing up with a broader understanding of the world than either the frontier or the cities could provide. "I've never seen anything like this," the youngest marshal confided to Ella on their final evening. "Back east, people talk about the Indian problem like it's some kind of natural disaster that has to be endured, but you folks seem to have found a way to turn the problem into a solution." "People aren't problems," Ella replied. "People are opportunities if you're willing to see them that way." When the marshals finally rode away, they carried with them not arrest warrants, but recommendations that the territorial government Consider the Bear Valley settlement as a model for future cooperation between settlers and tribal groups. It was a small victory, but an important one that helped legitimize their experiment in the eyes of distant authorities. Winter settled over the valley like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the kind of isolation that tested every community's bonds. Families were confined to their homes for days at a time by fierce storms, and the careful social structures they'd built during the warmer months were strained by the pressures of close quarters and limited resources. But they endured, supporting each other through the cold months with shared work, shared stories, and shared determination to see their experiment through to spring. Children born that winter were considered children of the entire community, regardless of their parents' racial heritage. Elders from all traditions were honored and cared for with equal respect. And through it all, Sarah grew and thrived in ways that filled Ella's heart with joy and wonder. Her daughter was becoming something unprecedented, a child equally at home in multiple cultures, equally comfortable with Lakota spiritual traditions, and Christian prayers, equally skilled with frontier survival techniques and traditional crafts. She's going to grow up different from any of us, Cayenne observed one evening as they watched Sarah help Winona prepare medicine from dried herbs. She'll understand things that we're still struggling to learn. Maybe that's the point, Ella replied. Maybe the children are the real reason we're here, to give them a chance to build something better than what we inherited. Spring came late but gloriously to Bear Valley, bringing with it new growth, new hope, and new challenges. The community had survived its first winter, but the one-year trial period they'd agreed upon was drawing to a close. Soon they would have to make permanent decisions about their future. It was on a warm morning in early May, as Ella was working in her garden with Sarah, that they heard the sound of approaching horses. A small party of riders was ascending the valley trail, and something about their manner suggested that this wasn't a casual visit. "Sarah, go get Cayenne and Apache," Ella said, her heart beginning to race with a mixture of hope and fear. "Tell them we have visitors." As the riders drew closer, Ella could make out individual figures, 3 men on horseback, travel-worn and dusty, with the kind of purposeful bearing that suggested a long journey undertaken for important reasons, and leading them, sitting his horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, was a figure that made Ella's knees go weak with recognition and overwhelming emotion. Thomas Whitmore had finally come home. He looked older than she remembered, his brown hair now streaked with gray, and his face lined with months of worry and hardship. But his eyes were the same warm blue that had captured her heart years ago, and when he saw her standing in the garden, the expression of joy and relief that crossed his features was like sunrise after the longest night. "Ella," he called out, his voice uncertain, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Ella, is that really you?" She was running then, her garden tools forgotten, her feet flying across the uneven ground toward the man she'd feared was lost forever. Behind her, she dimly heard Sarah's excited cry of "Papa!" But her entire world had narrowed to the miracle of Thomas's presence. He dismounted and caught her in his arms with the desperate strength of someone afraid that she might vanish like smoke if he didn't hold tight enough. For a long moment they simply clung to each other, their reunion made more precious by the months of uncertainty and fear they'd endured. "I never stopped looking," Thomas whispered against her hair. "Never stopped believing I'd find you and Sarah." "We're here," Ella managed through her tears. "We're safe and we're here." Then Sarah was there too, launching herself at her father with the fearless joy of childhood, and for a few perfect moments it seemed as though their family was complete again, as if the trauma and separation they'd endured had been nothing more than a terrible dream. But even as they held each other, Ella was aware of the community watching from a respectful distance. Cayenne stood with Apache and the others, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes reflecting a pain that he was trying to hide. This reunion, joyful as it was, would change everything for all of them. "Papa, you have to meet everyone," Sarah said, pulling back to look at her father, with eyes bright with excitement. "There's Winona, who took care of me, and Cayenne, who helped Mama rescue people, and Morning Star, who taught me to make dolls, and—" Thomas's expression shifted as he became aware of their surroundings, the mixed community of Indians and whites, the unusual cooperation he was witnessing, the obvious prosperity and harmony of the settlement. "This isn't what I expected to find," he said quietly, his eyes moving from the Lakota lodges to the settler cabins, to the children playing together without regard for racial differences. "A lot has changed," Ella said, suddenly aware of how difficult this moment was going to be for everyone involved. "Thomas, there are things I need to explain, things you need to understand about what we've built here." Over the following hours, she told him everything: her captivity, Sarah's rescue, the formation of their unlikely alliance, the battle with Tahuros, and the year-long experiment in cooperative living that had followed. Thomas listened with the careful attention of someone trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. "So you're telling me that you've been living peacefully with the same tribes that destroyed our homestead," he said when she'd finished. "Not the same tribes," Ella corrected. "Different people entirely who chose cooperation over conflict, and even some of the Apache who fought against us have become part of our community." Thomas shook his head slowly, struggling to reconcile his memories of that terrible morning with the reality he was witnessing. "I've spent 8 months tracking Apache war parties, following rumors and false leads, preparing for the moment when I'd take revenge for what they did to our family. And now?" Ella asked gently. "Now I don't know what to think," he admitted. "The people I was planning to kill are the same ones who saved my daughter's life and protected my wife. The community I thought I'd lost has been replaced by something I never could have imagined." That evening, the settlement held an impromptu celebration to welcome Thomas and learn his story. He told them about his desperate search, his encounters with various tribes and settlements, his gradual realization that his family might be lost forever. In return, community members shared their own stories of lost discovery and the gradual building of trust that had made their cooperation possible. Sarah stayed close to her father throughout the evening, as if afraid he might disappear again if she let him out of her sight. But Ella noticed that her daughter also continued to interact with her Lakota friends and to translate between different language groups, serving as a bridge between the world. Thomas remembered and the world she'd grown up in. "She's changed," Thomas observed quietly as they tucked Sarah into bed that night. "She's still our little girl, but she's also something more. She's become a child of multiple worlds," Ella agreed. "It's made her stronger, more adaptable, more understanding of different ways of life." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching their daughter sleep peacefully in the cabin that Ella had built with her own hands and the help of their community. "And what about you?" he asked finally. "How have you changed?" It was a question that went to the heart of everything Ella had been dreading about this reunion. How could she explain that her months of captivity and her year of building this community had transformed her in ways she was still discovering? How could she tell him about her growing feelings for Cayenne without devastating the man who had searched for her so faithfully? "I've learned that survival isn't enough," she said finally. "I've learned that it's possible to build something better than what we lost if we're willing to work for it and fight for it, and sometimes sacrifice for it." "And Cayenne Blackhawk," Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral. "What role does he play in this new life you've built?" Ella felt her heart constrict. Thomas wasn't a fool. He'd seen the way she and Cayenne looked at each other, the easy familiarity that had developed between them over months of shared struggle and triumph. "He's a good man who helped save our family," she said quietly, "and he's become someone I care about deeply." Thomas nodded slowly, his face showing the pain of a man confronting the reality that time and trauma had changed the people he loved in ways he couldn't control or undo. "I won't pretend that doesn't hurt," he said. "But I also can't pretend that I have any right to expect everything to be the same as it was before. We've all been through too much for that." The following weeks were among the most difficult in Ella's life as she tried to navigate the competing claims on her heart and loyalty. Thomas threw himself into the life of the community with determination, learning skills and customs that would help him fit into the world his family had chosen. But she could see the effort it cost him, the daily struggle to accept that the woman he'd married had become someone different during their separation. Cayenne, for his part, maintained a careful distance that was respectful but clearly painful. He continued his leadership role in the community, but avoided private moments with Ella, understanding that the situation was complicated enough without additional emotional pressure. "This is killing all of us," Mary Henderson observed one evening as she helped Ella with the washing. "Something's got to give, or this whole community is going to tear itself apart from the tension." "I don't know what to do," Ella admitted. "I love Thomas. I never stopped loving him, but I also love Cayenne, and I love the life we've built here. I can't choose without destroying something precious." "Maybe the choice isn't yours to make alone," Mary suggested gently. "Maybe it's time for all three of you to sit down and talk honestly about what you want and what you're willing to sacrifice for it." The conversation, when it finally happened, took place on a warm evening in late spring as the community prepared for the formal vote on whether to make their settlement permanent. The three of them sat by the creek that ran through the heart, the valley, the same creek where Ella had first begun to plan her escape from captivity a year earlier. "I need you both to know that I don't want to destroy what you've built here." Thomas began, his voice steady but strained. "This community is something special, something worth preserving, but I also need to know where I fit in Ella's life, if I fit at all." "You're Sarah's father," Ella said quietly. "That will always make you part of our lives, regardless of what else happens." "But that's not enough for me," Thomas replied. "I want to be your husband again, Ella. I want us to be a family, but I can see that you've moved beyond that, and I'm trying to accept it." Cayenne had been silent through this exchange, but now he spoke with the careful precision of someone who had been thinking deeply about the situation. "There's something you both should know," he said. "I've been offered a position with a tribal delegation going to Washington to negotiate new treaties. It would mean leaving the valley for at least a year, maybe longer." Ella felt her heart sink. "You're thinking of taking it?" "I'm thinking that maybe it's the right thing to do," Cayenne replied. "For the community, for you and Thomas, for everyone involved. This place doesn't need the complication of a love triangle tearing it apart. But it needs your leadership," Thomas said, surprising them both. "From what I've observed, you're one of the main reasons this experiment has worked as well as it has. Your leaving might solve my personal problems, but it would hurt everyone else." The three of them sat in silence for a while, listening to the sound of the creek and the distant laughter of children playing in the twilight. Finally, Ella spoke. "What if we stopped trying to solve this like it was a problem with only one right answer?" she said. "What if we accepted that love is complicated and families come in different forms, and sometimes the unconventional solution is the right one?" Both men looked at her with confusion and hope. "What are you suggesting?" Thomas asked. "I'm suggesting that maybe we can all choose to be a family," Ella said carefully. "Not in the traditional sense, but in the way this whole community has learned to be a family, with respect, affection, and commitment to each other's welfare." It wasn't a perfect solution, and it certainly wasn't a conventional one. But over the following months, as the settlement voted unanimously to make their experiment permanent, the three adults found ways to make their unusual arrangement work. Thomas and Ella renewed their marriage vows in a ceremony that incorporated traditions from multiple cultures, while Cayenne served as Sarah's honorary uncle and the community's continuing leader. There were awkward moments and painful adjustments, but there was also a growing understanding that love, like their community itself, could take forms that nobody had ever imagined before. By the time winter came again to Bear Valley, the settlement had grown to include nearly 100 people from a dozen different backgrounds. Children who had been born there spoke multiple languages fluently and moved easily between different cultural traditions. Adults who had arrived as strangers had become extended family to each other. And on quiet evenings, as Ella sat by her fire with Sarah reading beside her and the sounds of a thriving community all around them, she reflected on the long journey that had brought them all to this place. The attack that had destroyed her first home had ultimately led to the building of something far more remarkable, a community where differences were celebrated rather than feared, where former enemies had become family, where children grew up believing that cooperation was not only possible but natural. It wasn't the life she had planned or expected, but it was a life filled with purpose, community, and love in all its complicated forms. As she watched Sarah practice writing letters in both English and Lakota, preparing for a future that would undoubtedly hold challenges none of them could imagine, Ella smiled with the deep satisfaction of someone who had helped plant seeds that would grow long after she was gone. The frontier had always been a place where people came to reinvent themselves and their communities. In Bear Valley, they had done exactly that, proving that sometimes the most unlikely dreams could take root and flourish in the most unexpected soil. The fire crackled softly in the gathering darkness, and around it, the children of many peoples played together under the same stars, their laughter carrying on the wind like a promise of better days to come.